At 8:47 in the morning, a man walked into a military hospital with a rifle under his coat and murder in his eyes. And the only person in that entire building who recognized what he was doing was the nurse everybody called a liability. She had been written up twice, talked over in every meeting, told to stay in her lane by people who had never once left theirs. What those people didn't know, what nobody in that hospital knew, was that the quiet woman in blue scrubs had once crawled through enemy territory with 3 bullet wounds and still made it home. She had a call sign. She had a classified record. She had skills that didn't belong anywhere near a nurse's station. And today, every single one of those skills was about to matter. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories like this one, shocking, cinematic, and completely unforgettable. Smash the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. Mom. Her name was Nora Callahan. She was 31 years old, 5'6", with pale freckled skin and dark auburn hair. She kept pinned back so tightly it pulled at her temples by the end of every shift. She had a small scar below her left ear that she always covered with the collar of her scrub top. She didn't talk about where it came from. She didn't talk about much, actually. That was part of the problem, or at least that was what the people around her decided. Quiet women in hospital corridors made administrators nervous. They mistook silence for incompetence, stillness for fear, and careful observation for social awkwardness. Nora had been working at Crestfield Military Medical Center in Dunmore, Virginia, for just under 10 months. Dunmore was the kind of mid-sized military town that existed in the shadow of the base, where everything from the diners to the dry cleaners ran on military time, and every second person you passed had either served or was related to someone who had. Crestfield sat on the eastern edge of the city, a large beige brick building that smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee, with corridors that were always slightly too cold and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the quieter wings. It was not a bad hospital. It was, in fact, a reasonably well-run facility with a solid surgical team and a trauma unit that had seen its share of serious cases. The problem was not the medicine. The problem was the culture, the particular kind of institutional arrogance that accumulates in places where rank and tenure are treated as substitutes for judgment. Nora had noticed it in her first week. She had flagged it in her second. By the end of her third month, she had submitted 2 formal written reports about what she considered critical gaps in the facility's emergency response protocol, specifically regarding the security screening process at the main entrance and the absence of any working lockdown procedure for the patient wards. Both reports were filed. Neither was acted on. The first was dismissed by the chief of administration, a man named Garrett Pullman, who told Nora, without looking up from his desk, that she was new to civilian healthcare environments, and that Crestfield had been running safely for 17 years without her input. The second report generated a meeting, which generated a memo, which generated nothing else. What it did generate was a reputation. Nora Callahan became known as the nurse who complained, the worrier, the one who sent emails that were too long and raised concerns that nobody else seemed to share. Her supervising physician, Dr. Sylvia Marsh, had pulled her aside in October and told her, in a tone that was somehow both gentle and dismissive, that she needed to trust the system. "This hospital has protocols," Dr. Marsh said. "We all follow them. The way to build credibility here is to do your job well and let the experienced people handle the structural decisions." "I'm not questioning the clinical protocols," Nora said. "I'm talking about the entrance. Anyone can walk in through the East Wing right now with—" "Nora," Dr. Marsh cut her off with the kind of patient smile that meant the conversation was over. "Focus on your patients. That's where you add value." So Nora focused on her patients. She was, by any objective measure, an exceptional nurse. She was precise and fast. She had an almost uncanny ability to read vital signs and anticipate deterioration before the monitors caught it, and she remained completely calm under pressure in ways that even the seasoned staff occasionally noticed, and then quickly rationalized away. She never made medication errors. She never missed a dressing change. She caught a post-surgical complication on a Marine corporal named Taggart in November that 3 other nurses had walked past, and the surgical team later agreed that her intervention had almost certainly prevented a second emergency procedure. But she was still the rookie. She was still the one who got talked over in handoffs and interrupted during rounds. She was still the one the orderly named Phil stopped mid-sentence to ask if she needed help finding something, even though she had been working this floor for the better part of a year. She let most of it go. Not because she didn't notice, and not because it didn't matter. It mattered, more than she usually let herself think about, but because she had made a deliberate decision when she left the military that she was going to learn how to exist in a different kind of world. A world where problems were solved with paperwork instead of action, where you waited for systems to work instead of improvising around them, where the people above you were given the benefit of the doubt until they had clearly exhausted every last piece of it. She had been trying for 10 months to become someone who trusted that approach. It was harder than anything she had done overseas. The morning of February 14th started like any other Tuesday at Crestfield. Nora came in 20 minutes before her shift started, which she always did, and stopped at the nursing station on the second floor to review the overnight notes. There were 14 patients currently in her care, 3 of whom had been flagged for extra monitoring: a 62-year-old retired Army colonel recovering from a hip replacement, a 24-year-old female Marine who had come in the previous evening with a suspected blood clot, and a staff sergeant named Obi who had been admitted for a cardiac workup and kept insisting he felt fine and wanted to leave. "He disconnected his monitor again," said Priya, the outgoing night nurse, handing Nora a tablet and reaching for her bag at the same time. "Twice. I've documented it. Good luck." "I'll handle it," Nora said. "Also, the East Corridor bathroom has been out of service since Sunday, and nobody's fixed it. I've put in 3 requests." "I know, I put in 2. Priya gave her a look of exhausted solidarity and left. Nora spent the first 40 minutes of her shift doing assessments, adjusting the Marine's compression schedule, talking Obi into reconnecting his monitor by discussing football with him for 6 minutes, and making a note that the colonel's incision site looked slightly more inflamed than it had in the previous day's documentation. She called down to Dr. Marsh's office and left a message. She did not expect a fast callback. She put a flag in the chart and moved on. At 8:31 a.m., she was in the supply corridor on the east side of the building, pulling replacement IV bags, when she heard the door. It was the exterior side door, the one she had put in the first security report about, the one that was supposed to require a badge swipe from the outside, but had been sticking open for weeks because the magnetic lock had never been properly reset after a power outage in December. She had documented it. She had told maintenance. She had mentioned it to Garrett Pullman's assistant in passing, which meant it had been mentioned to no one with actual authority. The door opened, and then it didn't close. Nora didn't look up immediately. People used that door. Staff propped it open constantly, which was part of the problem she had tried to describe in her reports. She finished counting IV bags, tucked 2 under her arm, and then paused. She didn't hear footsteps continuing down the corridor. She heard them stop just inside the door. The difference was small. A fraction of a second's hesitation, a particular quality of stillness. But Nora had spent years in environments where the difference between a hesitation and a threat was the only thing standing between a good outcome and a catastrophic one. She turned her head slowly, not fast enough to signal alarm. There was a man standing just inside the door. Medium height, heavy jacket, a black duffel bag over one shoulder. He wasn't wearing a visitor badge. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was looking at the corridor in the particular way that people looked at spaces they were mapping, not exploring, not lost, but cataloging. Exits, camera positions, traffic patterns. Nora looked at the shape of the jacket near his right side. She set the IV bags down on the shelf very quietly and took 3 steps backward until she was around the corner. Her heart rate, to her own mild surprise, barely moved. Some things the body remembered without being asked. She pulled her phone from her pocket and called the security desk. It rang 4 times. "Security, hold, please." She didn't hold. She hung up and called the nursing station instead, where Donna, the ward clerk, picked up on the second ring. "Donna, listen carefully and don't react to what I'm saying. I need you to trigger the overhead page for the maintenance team on the second floor right now. Use the word urgent. Do it as calmly as you can." A brief pause. "Is something... Just do it, Donna. Now." There was a 3-second silence, and then she heard Donna's voice over the ward PA, slightly higher than normal, but holding together. "Maintenance team to second floor, urgent request, second floor maintenance." That was not the lockdown code. Crestfield didn't have a functioning lockdown code. That was what Nora's second report had been about. But it would, at minimum, give the staff on the floor something to pay attention to. And more importantly, it might move people away from the east corridor. Nora moved toward the stairwell. But by the time she reached the second-floor landing, things had already changed. She heard it before she saw it. Raised voices, the specific clatter of furniture being shoved rather than moved, and then, cutting through everything else, a sound she had heard on 2 separate continents and hoped she would never hear again. A rifle being racked. Not a handgun. A rifle. Long, mechanical, the sound of something being made ready rather than being drawn. It came from the main corridor near the nursing station. Nora stopped moving. She pressed her back against the stairwell wall, controlled her breathing in 4 counts, and assessed. She knew this building. She knew where the patients were, where the exits were, where the dead ends were, and, critically, she knew where the security cameras covered and where they didn't. She knew the east corridor had a camera gap between the supply room and the fire exit because she had written about it in her report and been told the gap was within acceptable parameters. She also knew that whatever was happening out there had just become something that her 10 months of careful, deliberate, try-to-trust-the-system effort was completely unequipped to address. She cracked the stairwell door. Through the gap, she could see the nursing station. Donna was standing with her hands raised, her face white, but her chin up. Nora noted that and felt a quick flash of respect for her. 2 men were in the corridor. One of them, the one from the east entrance, was now clearly holding a rifle at low ready. The second was moving patients and staff toward the far wall of the corridor. Not violently, not yet, but with the particular controlled efficiency of people who had planned this. 2 visible. That meant there were at least 2 more she couldn't see. A third voice came from the direction of the east wing. Then, from the lobby below, she heard shouting, male voices, multiple, overlapping, which suggested the entry point had been covered simultaneously. This was coordinated. This was not improvised. Nora closed the stairwell door and let herself think for exactly 8 seconds. She couldn't call 911 with a normal cell call and have it arrive in time to matter. She could reach the facility's phone in the maintenance closet 8 feet down the stairwell, the landline that maintenance used for internal calls, which was routed through a different system than the ward phones and was less likely to be monitored. She could also reach the second-floor medication room, which had a lockable door and a window that faced the exterior of the building. She could hide. She could lock herself somewhere and wait for law enforcement. She stood there for 1 full second, considering that option with genuine seriousness. And then she thought about the Marine with the suspected blood clot, who could not be moved quickly, and the Colonel with the inflamed incision, who would panic, and Obi, who had disconnected his cardiac monitor, and the dozen other people currently in beds or chairs or waiting rooms in this building who had no idea what was happening in the corridor. She went to the maintenance closet first. The phone there was an older model, a wall-mounted unit with a direct line to the base security office, not the hospital security desk, which was clearly already compromised, but the actual military installation security command, which was 7 minutes away by vehicle and would arrive in force. She dialed. It picked up in 2 rings. Base security, Sergeant Delaney. This is Nurse Nora Callahan, Crestfield Military Medical Center, 2nd floor. I need you to record what I'm about to say. We have an active armed incursion. Multiple subjects, at least 1 long rifle visible, minimum 4 individuals based on voice positions. East entrance was the breach point. Nursing station on floor 2 is compromised. I have 14 patients on this floor. I need a response team now. A half second of silence. Say again your name and floor. Callahan. 2nd floor. This is not a drill. I'm not in danger right now, but I will be if this takes another 60 seconds to process. Another pause. She could hear him moving, heard him say something to someone else in the room. Then, confirmed. Response teams are being activated. Can you remain on the line? Negative. I have patients to move. She hung up. But yeah, the next 12 minutes were the longest and most focused of Nora Callahan's life outside of a combat zone, which is to say, they were not calm, they were not clean, and they did not go according to any plan she could have written down in advance. She moved back to the stairwell. From the landing, she could hear that the situation on the 2nd floor had escalated. More voices now, a crash from the direction of the patient lounge, someone crying in a high, rhythmic way that suggested fear rather than injury. She needed to get to her patients without moving through the main corridor. The back passage. There was a service corridor that ran parallel to the main hall, originally designed for equipment transport, that connected the stairwell landing to the back of the ward. It was narrow and badly lit, and most of the staff didn't bother with it because it added 40 seconds to the route. Nora had used it exactly twice, both times when she needed to move equipment quietly without disturbing patients. She went through it now at a controlled pace. Not running, because running created sound, and she needed sound discipline in a way that no civilian in this building had any reason to understand. She reached the back access point for the patient ward. Through the thin interior wall, she could hear voices. One of the intruders, giving instructions in a flat, deliberate cadence that meant he was comfortable doing this. He was not panicking. He was not improvised. He knew what he was doing, and he expected to be in control of it. That told her a great deal. She eased the door open and slipped into the room directly adjacent to the ward, a storage alcove with a window looking out onto the corridor through a narrow observation panel. What she saw made her process of assessment shift from theory to immediate operational reality. There were 4 people in the main corridor now, 2 intruders and 2 staff members being held near the nursing station. One of the intruders was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular posture of someone who had military experience, or at least wanted people to think he did. He was holding the rifle. The second was younger, thinner, moving between the patient rooms and checking each one with a handgun drawn. The man with the rifle was doing the talking. "Nobody moves. Nobody calls. You do what I say. Everyone walks out of this building. That's all this is." His voice was measured. Whatever this was, extortion, information theft, someone's very bad plan for leverage over the military installation adjacent. He had rehearsed it. Nora watched him for 3 seconds and made a series of quiet, rapid calculations. He was standing with his back half-turned to the corridor junction that led to the east wing. He was monitoring the nursing station and the patient room doors in front of him. He was not watching the alcove where she was standing, because there was no reason for him to expect anyone to come from that direction. She wasn't going to take him. Not yet. Not while the second man was unaccounted for, and 2 others were still at large in the building. Going offensive with incomplete information about enemy positions was how people got other people killed, and she had learned that lesson at a cost she still dreamed about sometimes. What she was going to do was move her most critical patients. The Marine, Corporal Anessa Briggs, 24 years old, suspected deep vein thrombosis, current risk of pulmonary embolism if she was caused to exert herself or panic, was in room 204. The Colonel, retired Colonel Frank Deering, hip replacement, mobile but slow, was in 207. Obi, Staff Sergeant Obi Tran, 41, cardiac monitoring, currently without his monitor because he kept removing it, was in 211. She needed to get to all 3 without crossing the main corridor. The connecting door between the alcove and room 203 was unlocked. She checked it, found it empty. The patient who'd been in 203 had been discharged the previous evening and moved through. From 203, she could reach 204 through the interior patient passage, a shared access designed for nursing convenience that ran along the back of the rooms. She had used it before. She went through it now, pushing the door to 204 open as slowly as she could manage. Corporal Briggs was sitting up in bed, her jaw set, her eyes bright with controlled fear. She was the kind of young woman who had trained herself not to look scared even when she was, and right now she was managing it better than most people twice her age would have. "What's happening?" Briggs asked, barely above a whisper. "Armed individuals in the building. I need you to stay exactly where you are and not move. Do not get out of this bed for any reason. I mean that medically." Nora moved to the room's window, checked the exterior sightline, confirmed that it faced a wing of the building that appeared clear. "If I tell you to go to the window and get low, you do it without asking questions. Can you do that?" Briggs nodded. "Yes. If your leg starts to hurt more or you feel short of breath, you press that call button once, just once, and stay quiet. Understood?" "Understood." Nora moved back through the connecting passage. She reached the Colonel in 207 next. Frank Deering was 71 years old and had the posture of a man who had spent 40 years expecting bad news and preparing for it. He was already sitting on the edge of his bed when she came in, his face alert rather than frightened. I heard something, he said immediately. Yes. Bad? Manageable. I need you to move to the bathroom and stay there with the door locked. Take your blanket. If anyone knocks who isn't me, don't answer. I can help. I know you can. Right now, I need you to not be in that bed when someone opens that door. That's how you help me. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, with the particular assessment of someone who had spent a career evaluating people under pressure. And then he stood, took his blanket from the bed, and moved toward the bathroom without further argument. Young lady, he said from the doorway. Sir, be careful. She was already moving. Obi-Tran was the problem she had anticipated. When she slipped into room 211, he was standing near the window, his monitor leads dangling from where he'd pulled them loose again, his expression hovering between curiosity and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided he felt fine, regardless of what any machine said. I can hear them, he said quietly. Yes, I need you to... I was infantry, he said. I've heard that kind of quiet before, the kind where everyone's waiting. Nora stopped. She looked at him. He was heavier than he'd been, probably, when he was in the field, and his color wasn't great, and his cardiac workup wasn't complete, and she had real medical concerns about what any kind of exertion might do to him today. She also recognized the look in his eyes. You're on cardiac monitoring for a reason, she said. Your job right now is to stay in this room and keep your heart rate down. That's a direct medical order. And if they come in here, they won't. How do you know that? She met his eyes. Because I'm not going to let that happen. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't complete belief. He was too experienced for that, but it was something close to reassessment. You put your leads back on, she said. Right now. And you sit down. He sat. He started reattaching the monitor leads. What's your plan? He asked. Working on it. She left before he could ask anything else. Boss. Back in the service corridor, Nora stopped and counted what she knew. 4 subjects, likely. 2 confirmed visual in the main corridor, 1 confirmed audio from the east wing, 1 additional voice from the lobby, which meant ground floor coverage. They were moving deliberately and maintaining positions, which suggested they were waiting for something rather than escalating. Extraction of something or someone, possibly, or waiting for a specific time window. She had called base security. Response was coming, but 7 minutes from that call had already elapsed. They would arrive armed and with numbers, but they would arrive at a lockdown building with hostages at multiple points, and the first 3 minutes of a tactical team arriving at a scene like this were often the most dangerous for the people inside. She needed to reduce the threat variables before that door opened. The man with the rifle was the primary threat. The second, with the handgun, was the mobile element. The 2 she couldn't see were unknown quantities. She moved back toward the observation alcove. Through the narrow panel, she could see the main corridor. The man with the rifle, she had mentally assigned him the label lead for tracking purposes, had shifted position. He was now standing near the nursing station itself, one hand on the counter, speaking to Donna in a low voice. Donna's expression was flat and non-responsive, which was exactly the right approach. She was not giving him what he wanted. The younger one with the handgun, Mobile, had finished his sweep of the patient rooms and come back to the corridor. He said something to Lead that Nora couldn't quite make out, and Led shook his head. Whatever Mobile had reported, it wasn't what Led had expected. They were looking for something, or someone. Nora processed that for a moment, and the implication shifted the entire picture. This wasn't random intimidation. This wasn't a standard armed robbery. They had come into a military medical facility through a specific entrance, on a specific morning, and they were actively checking patient rooms in a way that suggested a target rather than a sweep, which meant the threat profile was different than she'd been working with. She needed to know who they were looking for. She had exactly one advantage in that. She had access to the patient roster, and they didn't. Whatever name they were looking for, it was on her chart. And if she could figure out which patient was the target before they did, she could move that person before the search reached them. She went back to the maintenance alcove and found a tablet that one of the overnight staff had left on the equipment shelf, standard ward tablet, logged into the patient management system with the previous user's credentials still active. She pulled up the roster. 14 patients. She went through them quickly, applying the filter of who would be worth this level of risk to extract or threaten from a military hospital. She stopped at the third name from the bottom. Captain Miriam Vasquez, USMC, 38 years old, admitted 3 days ago for treatment of a classified injury. Her room was listed as 219. She was flagged with a restricted access notation that Nora had noticed before and not thought much about. Classified injury, restricted access, a coordinated 4-person entry into a military medical facility. Nora closed the tablet and moved. Room 219 was at the far end of the east corridor, closer to where the third voice had come from, the one she'd identified from the east wing. She had to assume there was at least one person between her current position and that room. She went through the service passage again, deeper this time, moving past the junction she'd used before and continuing toward the east wing. The corridor narrowed. The lighting here was older, fluorescent tubes that flickered slightly. Her footsteps were almost completely silent. She had worn the soft-soled shoes she always wore on shift, had never thought about them as tactical equipment before, but they functioned as such right now. She heard him before she saw him. The third figure was stationed at the junction between the main service corridor and the east wing access, leaning against the wall, handgun at his side, not quite at full attention. He was younger than the others, early 20s, and the way he held the weapon suggested training that was recent but not deep. He was watching the wrong direction. Nora assessed the distance. 14 feet. The corridor was too narrow for a wide approach. She had no weapon, had nothing except her training, her hands, and the institutional knowledge of exactly where every piece of equipment in this building was stored. On the shelf beside her, a fire extinguisher, a mop bucket with a wheeled base, and 2 sealed containers of industrial cleaning solution. She looked at the fire extinguisher. She looked at the man 14 feet away. She made a decision. She lifted the extinguisher from its mount, slowly, two-handed, controlling the weight, and rolled the mop bucket into the corridor in front of her. Not hard, just enough to send it forward with a low rattle of wheels on tile. The third man turned toward the sound. Nora moved. She covered the 14 feet in less than 2 seconds, and the extinguisher connected with his weapon arm before he had finished processing what he was seeing. The handgun went down. He went down with it, and she had his arm behind his back and his face against the wall before he made a sound louder than a grunt. She pressed her knee into the back of his thighs, held his arm at the angle that made resistance painful and movement impossible, and leaned close to his ear. "Don't," she said quietly. He didn't. She used the cord from the mop bucket's handles, a 6-foot industrial tie cord, to secure his wrists, then removed his handgun and ejected the magazine, racking the slide to clear the chamber before setting it down on the shelf out of reach. She pulled the extinguisher pin and left it propped against the wall where it would be visible to anyone coming from the east wing. A marker, a deterrent, something to pause someone who didn't know whether the corridor was clear. Then she went to find Captain Vasquez. Room 219 was dark. The blinds were drawn and the overhead light was off, and for a moment before her eyes adjusted, Nora thought the room was empty. Then she heard breathing. "Captain Vasquez," she said very quietly. A movement in the corner, not the bed. The floor, beside the heating unit. A woman's voice, hoarse and clipped, said, "Who are you?" "Nurse Callahan. 2nd floor. I know what's happening and I know why they're here. I need you to come with me right now." "How do I know you're not with them?" "You don't, but they're currently between you and every exit in this building, and I'm currently between you and them, so your options are limited." A pause. Then the shape in this corner moved and Nora got her first look at Captain Vasquez. A compact woman with a bandaged right shoulder and the kind of face that had recently been through significant pain and was managing it by narrowing everything down to what was immediately necessary. "There's a response team coming," Nora said. "I called base security 9 minutes ago, but they're going to come in loud, and if Lead figures out we've moved you before they arrive, this gets complicated." "Lead?" "The one with the rifle. I've been tracking. There are 4 of them total. 3 now. The one from the East Junction isn't a factor anymore." Vasquez looked at her for exactly 1 second. The assessment was fast and efficient and distinctly non-civilian. "You're not just a nurse," she said. It wasn't a question. Nora didn't answer it. "Can you move?" "Yes." "Shoulder?" "Functional." "Follow me. Stay close. If I stop, you stop. If I go low, you go low. Don't make any sound you can avoid. She turned toward the service corridor. Behind her, she heard the distant sound of multiple vehicles arriving, the particular organized rumble of a tactical response that she had heard from the other side of the equation years ago, in places she no longer talked about. The response team was here, and somewhere in the main corridor of the second floor, she heard a voice, Lee's voice, the measured one, the one that had been so confident, beginning, for the first time, to lose its composure. Where is she? She was in 219. She was supposed to be in 219. He was looking for Vasquez. He was not going to find her. But what happened in the next 60 seconds, before the tactical team breached, before anyone with a badge and a radio got a clear picture of what was actually happening in this building, was going to determine whether those 60 seconds cost lives or saved them. Nora's hands were steady. Her mind was completely clear. She had spent 10 months trying to become someone who trusted systems and waited for the right people to handle things. Today was not that day. She moved Captain Vasquez through the service corridor at a pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough to stay quiet, keeping one hand slightly out to the side to signal stops when needed, listening to the building around her the way she used to listen to terrain. The sounds from the main floor had changed. Led's voice had gone from controlled to pressured, and that shift was important. Pressured people made faster decisions, and faster decisions in a situation like this usually meant worse ones. She could hear him moving through the corridor, checking rooms, the interval between his footsteps shorter now, less deliberate. He knew something had gone wrong. He didn't know how much. Vasquez followed without a word, which told Nora more about her than anything in the chart had. The bandaged shoulder was clearly causing pain. She could see it in the way Vasquez held herself, the slight forward tilt that meant she was protecting the right side without thinking about it. But she made no sound, and she didn't slow down, and she kept exactly the right distance behind Nora through 3 corridor junctions without being told. They reached the access point Nora had in mind, a fire exit on the northwest side of the building that opened to an exterior stairwell, which connected to a ground-level maintenance area that ran along the back of the building. The door had an alarm bar. The alarm would trigger when they pushed it. Nora knew that. She also knew that in approximately 40 seconds, the base security response team was going to breach the main entrance, and the noise of that entry was going to be considerably louder than one fire exit alarm. She looked at Vasquez. When that door opens, we move straight across the exterior lot to the maintenance structure on the left. Don't stop. Don't look back. If I go down, you keep moving. Vasquez held her gaze. Understood. Nora pushed the bar. The alarm went off, a sharp, flat electronic shriek, and they moved. The cold hit her immediately, the February air cutting through her scrub top in a way she registered and set aside. The exterior stairwell was metal, and their footsteps rang on it despite everything, and she took them in twos with one hand on the railing and hit the bottom landing in under 4 seconds. The maintenance structure was 60 feet across the lot, a low concrete building used for equipment storage, always unlocked during operational hours, positioned behind a line of utility vehicles that would provide cover for most of the approach. They were 30 feet out when the main entrance of Crestfield went loud. She heard it clearly even from outside, the organized overlapping sequence of a tactical breach, commands being issued in the particular rapid cadence of people who had rehearsed this exact thing. Multiple entry points, multiple teams. They had come prepared for a contested space, which meant base security had taken her call seriously and escalated it appropriately. She also heard, from the second floor, the sound of Led's voice reaching a register she hadn't heard from him before. He knew it was over. That was the most dangerous moment. People who knew it was over sometimes accepted it. People who knew it was over and couldn't accept it sometimes decided to make the ending cost as much as possible. She pushed Vasquez through the maintenance structure door and pulled it shut behind them. Inside, it smelled of motor oil and cold concrete. Shelving units along the walls held equipment she recognized. Portable generators, folded stretchers, the kind of heavy gear that rarely got used and never got organized properly. A single overhead fluorescent light was on, humming. Vasquez leaned against the shelving with her good shoulder and looked at Nora with the expression of someone who had run out of adrenaline for approximately 45 seconds and was using that window to take stock. "You want to tell me who you are?" she said. "I told you, Nurse Callahan, second floor." "Right." Vasquez paused. "And the guy you apparently took down in the service corridor?" "He's secured. He'll be fine unless someone tries to ask him to use that arm." A silence. Outside, they could hear radio chatter, the response team working through the building. "You've done this before," Vasquez said. It wasn't phrased as a question this time either. Nora was quiet for a moment. She was watching the door, her attention divided between the conversation and the sounds coming from outside, running a constant background calculation about what was happening and what it meant for the people she'd left inside. "I need to get back in there," she said. "The response team is in the building. I have 14 patients on that floor, and I don't know where Lead is or whether he's still trying to use one of them as leverage." She looked at Vasquez directly. "You stay here. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't identify themselves with a specific unit designation. Can you do that?" "I'm a Marine Corps captain," Vasquez said, with the precise dryness of someone who found the question slightly insulting. "Yes," Nora almost smiled. "There's a pry bar on the second shelf behind you." She left. Getting back in required going through the maintenance structure's interior access point, a connecting door to the hospital's basement level that was supposed to be locked but that Nora had seen a maintenance worker prop open with a rubber wedge earlier that morning. She had noted it the same way she noted most things in this building, as a security gap, as a procedural failure, as something she should probably put in a report that would go into a folder that would go somewhere it would never be read. Today, it was an asset. The basement was dim and industrial. HVAC systems, electrical panels, the kind of infrastructure that kept the upper floors functional and that nobody visited unless something broke. She moved through it toward the service stairwell and went up. On the second floor, the tactical team had already established control of the main corridor. She could hear them, the crisp professional cadence of people working a cleared space, and she identified herself loudly and clearly before she appeared at the stairwell door, both hands visible, moving slowly. "Nurse Callahan, second floor. I'm the one who made the call." The first officer through the stairwell door was a compact woman in tactical gear with a badge clipped to her vest. She had her weapon at low ready, and she assessed Nora in about a second and a half before she relaxed fractionally and said, "Stay right there. There are 14 patients on this floor. One of them, Corporal Briggs, room 204, is a DVT risk and cannot be moved without assessment first. There's also a cardiac patient in 211 who I strongly suspect removed his monitor at some point in the last 20 minutes. The officer looked at her. "You're the nurse who called it in?" "Yes." "You're also the one who secured the individual in the East Service corridor?" "With a mop cord, yes. He needs his arm checked when you process him. I may have been harder on the joint than I intended." Another pause. The officer, her badge read Sergeant Flores, was doing the same rapid reassessment that Vasquez had done, looking at Nora with the expression of someone revising a category. "The armed individual in the main corridor is in custody," Flores said. "We have 2 others contained near the lobby. The 4th has not been located." Nora's attention sharpened. "The one in the East corridor was the 3rd. The 4th is unaccounted for?" "Correct." "Then I need to check my patients now." Flores didn't exactly agree, but she also didn't stop her. She moved alongside Nora down the corridor, which was now occupied by 2 additional officers and a Crestfield security guard who had appeared from somewhere and was looking deeply shaken. Donna was still at the nursing station. She was sitting down now, hands flat on the counter, and when she saw Nora, she let out a breath that had been held for a very long time. "I did the page," she said. "You did great," Nora said. "Are you hurt?" "No, just—" Donna stopped. "The big one had his gun out for a while, near my face. I kept thinking I should do something, but I didn't know what." "You did the right thing. You stayed calm, and you didn't give them a reason to escalate." Nora put her hand briefly on Donna's shoulder. "I'm going to check the rooms. Don't move yet." She went to 204 first. Corporal Briggs was exactly where Nora had left her, in the bed, sitting up, jaw set. Her leg was elevated and she hadn't moved. When the door opened, she looked up with the carefully controlled expression of someone who had spent the last 20 minutes talking herself out of panic. "Is it done?" she asked. "Almost. How's the leg?" "The same." "Pain level?" 4, maybe. Same as before. Nora did a quick manual check, palpation, checking warmth and color, and found nothing immediately alarming. "You did well. I mean it." Briggs exhaled. Her hands, which had been very still on the blanket, finally relaxed. "What was happening? Was it—" "I'll explain when I know more. Right now, I need to check the others." She moved to the door. "Don't get out of bed." "Still not planning to," Briggs said, and for the first time her voice had a thread of dry humor in it. The colonel was in the bathroom, as instructed, sitting on the closed toilet lid with his blanket around his shoulders, and the calm patience of a man who had learned a long time ago how to wait out situations he couldn't control. He had his hands folded in his lap, and he looked up when Nora opened the door with an expression of dignified, moderate relief. "Is it finished?" he asked. "Getting there. Are you all right?" "Hip aches, otherwise intact." He paused. "I heard a great deal of activity about 15 minutes ago." The response team came in. "Were there casualties?" "Not that I know of. I'll find out." She offered her hand and helped him stand. "Let's get you back to bed. I need to check your incision site." "It's fine," he said automatically. "Let me be the judge of that, sir." He made a small sound that was either disagreement or approval. She wasn't entirely sure, and let her guide him out of the bathroom. The incision was not significantly worse than it had been that morning, which was a relief. She redressed it, got the colonel settled, and moved on. She found Obi-Tran sitting exactly where she'd left him, with his monitor leads attached and his arms folded across his chest. His heart rate on the bedside monitor was elevated, 94 beats per minute, which was not dangerous, but was not ideal. And he was looking at the door with the expression of a man who had spent the last 30 minutes actively restraining himself from going out into the corridor to see what was happening. 94, she said, checking the readout. "I know what it is," he said. "You kept the leads on. You told me to." She looked at his face. The color was better than she expected, actually, and she checked his blood pressure and did a quick auscultation of his chest. Nothing acutely alarming. The elevation was stress-related, which was essentially unavoidable under the circumstances. "Were any of your guys hurt?" he asked. She looked up. "My guys?" "The patients. Your floor." She thought about how to answer that. "I don't have a full picture yet. I don't think so, but I need to confirm." He nodded slowly. "You want to tell me what the hell just happened out there?" "When I know more, yes." She marked his chart. "For now, your job is still to keep that heart rate down." "Hard to do after an armed incursion." "I know. Try anyway." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Nurse Callahan." His voice was different now. Slower, more considered. "You didn't go hide somewhere, did you?" She didn't turn around. "Get some rest." She left him with the question unanswered because it wasn't really a question. "Yimas." The corridor had shifted again by the time she came back out. 2 more response team members had arrived on the floor, along with a man in plain clothes who had the particular posture of someone from an investigative office. Federal, she guessed, from the cut of his jacket and the ID case clipped visibly to his belt. He was speaking with Sergeant Flores near the nursing station, and he looked up when Nora appeared. "Nurse Callahan," Flores said. "This is Agent Decker, CID." "Ma'am," Decker said. He was in his late 40s, with the unhurried quality of someone who had learned to process fast-moving situations by slowing his own pace down. "I understand you were the initial contact for the base security response." "I called it in, yes. I also understand you secured one of the 4 subjects." "Yes." "East Service Corridor. He needs his shoulder looked at." Decker had a notebook open, but he wasn't writing anything in it yet. He was looking at her in the same way that Vasquez had, the same rapid recalibrating assessment, except his was more careful, more professional, and it lasted longer. Can you walk me through your actions from the time you identified the threat? He asked. She could. She did, concisely and in order, covering what she'd seen, what she'd inferred, the calls she'd made, the patients she'd moved, the corridor approach, the contact in the East Wing. When she finished, Decker looked at her for a moment without speaking. You had no weapon, he said. Correct. You approached and physically controlled an armed individual using a mop bucket as a distraction and a mop cord as a restraint. Essentially, yes. What's your background, Ms. Callahan? She had known this was coming since Vasquez asked it and she'd deflected. She had known, honestly, since the moment she walked out of that maintenance closet with a handgun in her hand and the institutional memory of a dozen similar corridors in a dozen places that didn't appear on most maps. I have relevant training, she said. Decker waited. Former Navy, she said. I prefer not to get into specifics until I know more about the scope of your investigation. Another pause. Decker nodded, not pressing it, which told her he already had a sense of what the specifics were, or at least suspected. The fourth subject, he said. We're still looking. I know. That concerns me more than the ones you have. Why? She thought about Led's voice, the way it had changed when he realized Vasquez wasn't in room 219, the way a mission changes when the primary objective becomes impossible, the way the calculation shifts from extraction to something uglier. Because the first three were here for a specific purpose, and that purpose failed, she said. The fourth doesn't know that yet. Or he does know, and he's deciding what to do about it. Either way, he's less predictable than the others right now. Decker held her gaze for a moment, then said something into his radio. Flores appeared at Nora's elbow. Your patients need assessment, she said, which wasn't wrong. Nora nodded and moved to continue her rounds. She was at the nursing station updating Corporal Briggs' chart when she heard it. It was quiet. Very quiet, which was the first thing that caught her attention. A sound that should have been there and wasn't. The building had a particular ambient noise profile that she had mapped without thinking about it over 10 months. The hum of the HVAC through the west ceiling vents, the elevator mechanism, the baseline activity from the nurses' stations on both floors. The pattern had been disrupted during the incident and was beginning to reestablish itself, but there was a gap in it, a pocket of absence from the direction of the South Supply Annex that wasn't right. She set down the tablet. She looked at the south corridor. Then she said quietly to Donna, Where is Dr. Marsh's office? Third floor, Donna said. South wing. Why? Is anyone up there right now? Donna frowned. The third floor was cleared by the response team. They said, Who was the last person cleared from the third floor? I don't know. I wasn't given that information. I've been down here the whole... Nora was already moving towards Sergeant Flores. She kept her voice low. Your team cleared the third floor. Do you have confirmation of the specific rooms? Flores checked her radio. Third floor cleared at 9:41. Offices and patient rooms, yes. The administrative suite in the south wing, Dr. Marsh's office specifically. Was that on the sweep? A pause as Flores checked. Then, the administrative suite door was locked. Standard protocol was, Dr. Marsh has a keycard that overrides the standard lock. Any hospital staff member with administrative privileges can open that suite from the inside even when it's locked from the hall. Nora was watching Flores' face. If your sweep knocked on a locked administrative door and received no response, they marked it clear and moved on. Flores was already on the radio. She got back a confirmation in under 20 seconds and her expression changed, just fractionally, the professional neutral giving way to something tighter. Room's been accessed, she said. There's a window in the administrative suite that opens to the south exterior. It's open. He went up, not out, Nora said. The exterior window opens to the maintenance ladder that runs to the roof access on the south side of the building. I documented that in a security report 8 months ago. Flores stared at her. Third floor has exterior ladder access to the roof line, Nora said. If he went up that way, he's on the roof. Flores was speaking into her radio before Nora finished the sentence, and then there were footsteps from multiple directions, and Decker came around the corner fast for a man who moved slowly, and for about 45 seconds the corridor was all controlled urgency. Nora stepped back and let them work. She went back to the nursing station. She picked up the tablet, She updated Briggs's chart, then Obi's, then started on the colonel's incision documentation because those things still needed doing regardless of what was happening above her. It was Donna who told her, 11 minutes later, when the radio traffic had changed again. "They got him," Donna said from across the station. Her voice was shaky with relief. "The fourth one. They got him on the roof." Nora looked up. She felt something move through her chest. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter than either of those. The particular feeling of a situation resolving that never should have started. "Good," she said, and she went back to the chart. The debriefing took 3 hours. It took place on the 4th floor, in a conference room that had been commandeered by the CID team, and it was attended by Agent Decker, 2 additional investigators whose names Nora was given but filed away without much attention, and eventually, arriving midway through with the expression of someone who had been briefed rapidly and was still catching up. Colonel Arthur Finch, from the base command, who was the senior military authority on scene, and whose presence in the room changed the weight of everything in it. Nora answered the questions. All of them. She was honest and specific, and she gave the timeline accurately, including the gaps in her knowledge and the moments where she had made judgment calls that could have gone differently. She did not soften or over-explain. She did not apologize for what she'd done in the East Corridor, and she didn't frame it as anything other than what it was. A decision made under pressure with incomplete information and a limited set of options. Partway through, Decker stopped the interview and set his pen down and looked at her directly. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I need to ask you something off the record." "You can ask it," she said. "I'll decide whether to answer." A brief, acknowledging pause. "Your service record is classified at a level that my clearance doesn't fully cover. I have access to the summary, not the detail. But the summary indicates a specific specialty." He paused. "The actions you took today are consistent with that specialty." She waited. "I'm not asking for confirmation," Decker said. "I'm telling you that the people above my clearance level are going to have questions, and I think you should be prepared for that." She held his gaze. "I've been prepared for a lot of things over the years." He nodded once, picked his pen back up, and they continued. Colonel Finch said very little during the interview itself. He listened. He had the particular quality of stillness that Nora associated with experienced military leadership, the kind that had learned the information-gathering value of silence. Once, he asked her to repeat the sequence of events in the East Service Corridor. She did, with the same specificity as the first time. After the interview was officially concluded, when Decker and the 2 other investigators had stepped out to coordinate with the teams below, Finch remained. He was a tall man, late 50s, gray at the temples, and the short cut of his hair. He had the bearing of someone who had been authoritative for so long it was simply part of his posture. He said, "I read your security reports." She looked up. "Both of them?" "Both." He paused. "This morning, after the call came in, I had my aide pull every piece of documentation that had been filed about this facility's security protocols in the last 12 months. She waited. "You were right," he said. "About the east entrance, about the exterior ladder, about the lockdown protocol gaps." He looked at her without apology, which she respected more than apology would have earned. "Those reports should have been acted on." "Yes, sir," she said. "They should have." "They weren't. That's a failure at several levels of this institution, and it will be addressed." He paused. "I want you to know that what you did today, the call you made, the patients you protected, the information you provided to the response team, directly shaped the outcome of this incident." "I know," she said, not arrogant, just factual. Finch looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "You're more interesting than your personnel file suggests," he said. She didn't respond to that. "There are going to be some conversations in the next few days about your background and your status here at Crestfield," he said. "I expect you're aware of that." "I suspected it." "Those conversations are going to involve people above my level." He stood, straightening his jacket. "I intend to make sure the context of this morning is part of whatever they decide." He left. Nora sat in the empty conference room for approximately 90 seconds. She looked at the wall. She thought about the east corridor and the mop cord and the man's arm under her knee. She thought about Corporal Briggs sitting in bed with her jaw set and her hands very still. She thought about Obi reconnecting his monitor leads because she'd told him to. She thought about 10 months of security reports going into folders. Then she stood up, smoothed her scrub top, and went back to work. The third floor was still restricted when she passed it on the way down, 2 investigators still visible through the glass panel of the stairwell door. The 4th floor above her was quiet. The 2nd floor, her floor, had been partially reopened to essential staff, which meant the nursing station was running again, and Donna was back in position with the particular brisk efficiency of someone who had decided that forward motion was the best response to what she'd experienced. 2 of the response team officers were still on the floor, stationed at either end of the corridor. They both looked at Nora when she came through the stairwell door. The look was not dismissive. It was something else, a recalibration she was starting to recognize, the particular quality of attention from people who had updated their file on her. She had 3 patients whose medication schedules were now off by over 2 hours, which was going to require careful management. She had the colonel's wound to reassess at the end of the shift. She had Obi's cardiac situation to follow up on, and she had Corporal Briggs's mobility assessment that had been scheduled for 10 a.m. and had obviously not happened. She picked up the tablet and started from the beginning. She was in the supply corridor, the same one she had been in when she first heard the east door, getting the delayed medication supplies when she heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was Dr. Sylvia Marsh. Marsh was in her late 40s with neat silver-streaked hair and the kind of composed professional affect that didn't rattle easily. She was rattled now, not visibly. She was maintaining the composure because it was too built into her to drop quickly, but the edges were showing. Her jacket was slightly off-center in a way it never usually was. She had been on the 3rd floor when the 4th subject accessed the administrative suite. She stopped when she saw Nora, and something moved across her face, something complicated that Nora watched carefully without reacting to. "Nurse Callahan," she said, "Dr. Marsh, are you all right?" A pause that was a fraction too long. "Yes, I was on the 3rd floor. The investigators were—" She stopped, started again. "I heard what you did." "From the investigators?" "From them. And from Colonel Finch." Another pause. "And from Donna." Nora waited. Marsh's expression went through several things at once, guilt and relief, and something that might have been embarrassment, and underneath those, something that looked like it was trying to be genuine. "You told me in October that the east entrance was a security risk," Marsh said. "I told several people," Nora said, "in writing." "Yes." Marsh looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I told you to focus on your patients." "You did." I thought you were being—" She stopped. She seemed to understand, or to be in the process of understanding, that there was no version of this sentence that ended well. "I was wrong," she said, and her voice was flat in the way that direct statements from people who weren't used to making them always sounded. Not gracious, exactly, but real. Nora looked at her for a moment. She thought about 10 months of carefully worded, professionally formatted reports. She thought about the meeting that generated a memo that generated nothing. She thought about stay in your lane. "I know you were," she said. It wasn't generous. It wasn't meant to be. But it was honest, and honest was what she had. Marsh nodded once, pressed her lips together, and walked back down the corridor. Nora turned back to the supply shelf. She was counting IV bags, the same task she had been doing when the door opened this morning, when her radio crackled. It was Flores's voice. "Callahan, this is Flores. We need you on the 4th floor, now." Something in the tone. Nora set down the bags. "What's happening?" "The lead subject, the one with the rifle. He's been asking for you by name since we booked him." She went still. "He says he has information," Flores said. "He won't talk to anyone else. He keeps saying—" A pause, the sound of radio static. "He keeps saying you already know what this was about, that you figured it out." Nora thought about Led's voice at the end, the way it had gone from controlled to pressured. She thought about Vasquez in room 219 and the classified injury, and the 4 people who had come in through a specific door on a specific morning for a specific target. She thought about what she had inferred and not said aloud to Agent Decker. She thought about what it meant that the man with the rifle, now in custody, wanted to talk to the nurse who had unraveled his operation, and what he thought she already knew. She wasn't sure whether it was accurate, but the possibility that it was. The possibility that there was something in this situation she had correctly identified, and that someone was now counting on her not to share, sent a specific kind of chill through her that had nothing to do with the February air still lingering in her uniform. She keyed the radio. "I'm on my way." She moved toward the stairwell, and behind her the supply corridor was empty and quiet, and the IV bags she'd been counting sat uncollected on the shelf. And somewhere on the fourth floor, a man who had come here to do something she hadn't yet fully understood was waiting to have a conversation that she suspected was going to change the shape of this day in ways she couldn't predict. The fourth floor smelled different from the second, less antiseptic, more administrative. The particular scent of carpet and recycled air that accumulated in spaces where people sat at desks and made decisions about other people's work without doing much of it themselves. Nora took the stairs. She always took the stairs. At the landing, Sergeant Flores was waiting with Agent Decker and a third person she hadn't seen before, a woman in civilian clothes with a federal ID she didn't display prominently, and the particular quality of attention that Nora associated with intelligence work rather than law enforcement. The distinction was subtle but consistent. Law enforcement people watched what you did. Intelligence people watched what you were about to do. "Before you go in," Decker said, "I need to give you context." "Go ahead." "His name is Roland Greer, 47. Former Army, honorable discharge 11 years ago. Since then, he's been associated with a private contractor group called Meridian Operational Services. We've been tracking Meridian for about 18 months. He paused. "Greer agreed to be interviewed, but only with you in the room. He's been consistent about that since processing." "Did he say why?" "He said you understand the real situation." Decker's expression was neutral in a way that suggested it was being maintained. He also said, and I am quoting, "She didn't go after the package, she went after the patient. That means she already knows what this isn't about." Nora processed that for a moment. The woman with the federal ID spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet and unhurried. "Ms. Callahan, my name is Hartwell. I work for an agency I'm not going to identify in this hallway. What I can tell you is that Captain Vasquez's presence at this facility was known to a limited number of people, and the fact that Greer's team came here today with specific intelligence about her location represents an operational breach that we are treating with significant seriousness." She paused. "Greer talking to you is either an asset or a complication, possibly both. I'd like you to go in and find out which." "What am I authorized to tell him?" "Nothing classified, but don't perform ignorance. He'll read it." Nora looked at the door at the end of the corridor. "Is he restrained?" "Wrist to the table. There are 2 officers inside. Keep them back, against the wall." Hartwell looked at her steadily. "You've done interrogations before." "I've had conversations with people in difficult situations," Nora said, which was the most accurate and least informative way to answer that, and she walked down the hall before anyone could press it further. The room they were using was a repurposed administrative office. The desk pushed to one side, 2 chairs facing each other across a smaller table that had been brought in, the kind of improvised interview setup that happened when the right space wasn't available and the situation wasn't willing to wait. 2 officers stood against the far wall. One was young and holding his posture rigid, which meant he was nervous. The other was older and leaning very slightly, which meant she wasn't. Roland Greer was seated at the table. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, thick-necked, with the particular density of someone who had maintained a physical discipline for a long time. His wrists were cuffed to the table ring. His rifle had been a semi-automatic platform she'd clocked as a modified variant of something that wasn't commercially standard, which told her his equipment budget had been substantial. His hair was military short, gray at the sides. He had a cut above his eyebrow from the takedown, which had been assessed and closed with butterfly tape. He looked at her when she came in. Not the way people usually looked at her in this building. Not the dismissive or distracted or mildly condescending look she had grown accustomed to over 10 months. He looked at her the way a professional looks at another professional. Direct, calibrating, specific. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without preamble. You asked for me, she said. I did. His voice was the same one she'd heard from the corridor. Measured, deliberate, the voice of someone who had trained themselves to project control. It was still doing that, but it was working harder than it had been 3 hours ago. You know why? Tell me anyway. He studied her for a moment. You figured out Vasquez was the target before we found her room. You moved her before we got there. That's not nursing instinct. People with medical experience can make reasonable inferences. Nurse Callahan. He said her name with a slight emphasis that meant he was making a point. I've run operations in 6 countries. I know what I'm looking at. You took down one of my men with a cleaning supply and a rope. He paused. His shoulder, by the way. Is it actually damaged? Probably a partial AC separation. He'll need imaging. That's not nothing. No, it isn't. She held his gaze. You said you understand what this isn't about. Explain that. He was quiet for long enough that the younger officer against the wall shifted his weight. Then Greer said, Vasquez isn't the primary target. She never was. Nora didn't move, didn't alter her expression. Who is? The information she carries. His jaw tightened slightly. Vasquez was here for a procedure. Something classified. Something connected to an operation that went wrong 8 months ago overseas. The people who hired us don't care about her. They care about what she witnessed and what she documented before she came in for treatment. Medical records. Not medical records. The procedure she came in for isn't orthopedic. He glanced at her shoulder bandage reference from memory and corrected himself. That injury is real, but she came here specifically because this facility has a secured records annex on the basement level that's used for classified documentation transfer. She was scheduled to deposit something. Nora let the silence sit for a moment. You came here to intercept the transfer. We came here to retrieve specific documentation before it entered the federal evidence pipeline. He said it without apology, but also without pride. The flat tone of someone describing a job rather than justifying it. Vasquez was leverage, not the objective. So when you couldn't find her, the mission was already compromised. We knew that the moment your security call went out. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you this because whoever hired Meridian for this job knew Vasquez was coming here. They had her schedule, her room assignment, her procedure date. That level of access doesn't come from outside the facility. The room was very quiet. The older officer against the wall had stopped leaning. Nora kept her eyes on Greer. You're telling me someone inside Crestfield gave your employers the intelligence for this operation? Yes. And you're telling me this because I didn't sign up to take a hospital hostage. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not performative, just a line going slightly harder at the jaw. Meridian told us this was a document retrieval. In and out, minimal contact, no casualties. What we walked into was planned as something else by the people above us. He paused. I want to know who set us up as much as your federal friends out there do. Nora sat with that for a moment. She was aware that this could be a manipulation, that Greer was a skilled operator who knew exactly what information would create leverage, who knew that offering to cooperate carried its own strategic value. She didn't discount that possibility. She also believed him partly, which she held separately from whether his motives were clean. The documentation Vasquez was carrying, she said. Do you know what it contains? Enough to know that it implicates people who have access to military medical facilities and the patience to plan a retrieval operation through a private contractor. He held her gaze. The kind of people who could bury security reports for a year. Nora felt something move through her that wasn't quite cold and wasn't quite anger. It was more specific than either of those. The particular clarity that came when a pattern she'd been tracking instinctively became something she could name. Her security reports, the east entrance, the exterior ladder, the lockdown protocol gaps, 10 months of documentation that went into folders and generated memos and produced nothing. And she had told herself it was institutional inertia, bureaucratic negligence, the ordinary failure of large organizations to respond to small warnings. She had told herself it was nobody's fault in particular. She stood up. I'll pass your statement to Agent Decker, she said. If you're willing to make it formally, do it now. Don't make them come back to you for it. Greer looked at her for a moment. You already knew, he said, not accusing, almost something like respect. Not the specifics, but you knew something was wrong with how those reports were handled. She looked at him. I reported it through the appropriate channels, she said, several times. And nothing happened. And nothing happened, she confirmed, and she walked out. Hartwell was in the corridor, close enough to the door that Nora suspected she had been listening through it, which was fine. She had nothing to hide. You heard most of that, Nora said. Enough. Hartwell's expression had sharpened, the unhurried quality replaced by something more immediate. The documentation Greer referenced. I need to speak with Captain Vasquez right now. Where is she? Still in the maintenance structure unless someone moved her. She should have been brought in during... I told her to wait. She was waiting. Have you checked? Hartwell was already on her phone. A short conversation, then... She's been brought to the first floor security office. A pause. She's also been asking for you. Vasquez? Apparently you're having quite a day for people wanting to talk to you specifically. Nora started toward the stairs. Callahan. Hartwell's voice stopped her. Greer's disclosure changes the scope of this investigation considerably. What he's describing, an internal source with facility access, means this building is still a compromised environment. I know. Your patients are my patients, Nora said. I'll be back on the floor in 20 minutes. She didn't wait for Hartwell's response. Vasquez was in the first floor security office, a small room behind the main desk that smelled of old coffee and had a whiteboard on one wall still covered in shift schedules from the previous week. She was sitting on the edge of a folding chair with her good arm across her lap, and the bandaged shoulder held in the particular careful stillness of someone managing pain through positioning rather than medication. She looked up when Nora came in. Your shoulder needs a new dressing, Nora said immediately, because it was true, and because starting with the clinical fact was the most honest thing she could offer. Sit down, Vasquez said. The shoulder's fine. It's not... Sit down, Callahan. Nora sat. Vasquez studied her for a moment with the same focused assessment she'd been doing since the maintenance structure. Hartwell talked to you. Greer did first. Something passed across Vasquez's face. What did he say? Nora gave her the summary. Accurate, concise, no editorializing. When she finished, Vasquez was quiet for long enough that the room felt heavier. The documentation, Vasquez said finally. Greer was right that it exists. He was wrong about one thing. She looked at Nora directly. I didn't bring it here to deposit it. I came here because this is the only facility within a 4-state radius that has a secured medical annex with a specific encryption protocol that my commanding officer trusted. She paused. I came here to make a copy. The original is somewhere else. Somewhere else meaning somewhere they can't access it regardless of what happened here today. Vasquez shifted slightly, and the shoulder movement made her jaw tighten before she controlled it. The operation that went wrong 8 months ago, 3 service members were killed in a situation that was presented as enemy contact. It wasn't. Her voice was even. There was an exchange, information for access. Someone with the right clearances sold a route to the wrong people, and 3 of my colleagues died for it. She met Nora's eyes. The documentation I'm carrying is the evidence trail. Nora was quiet. She thought about what Greer had said, that the people who hired Meridian had facility access, had Vasquez's schedule, her room number. She thought about 10 months of security reports that had been systematically ignored by the people best positioned to act on them. The internal source that Greer mentioned, Nora said slowly. Yes. Is that person connected to the operation? The one that killed your colleagues? Vasquez looked at her steadily. What do you think? Nora thought about Garrett Pullman telling her she was new to civilian healthcare environments without looking up from his desk. She thought about the first security report going into a folder. She thought about the second one generating a meeting that generated a memo that generated nothing. I think, she said carefully, that deliberately ignoring a security vulnerability at a military medical facility is a very specific kind of useful, if you know in advance that you're going to need that vulnerability. Vasquez's expression didn't change. 8 months is enough time to plan. Who knows about the documentation? My commanding officer, the investigative unit handling the case. 3 other people I trust absolutely. Vasquez paused. And now you. Why are you telling me? Because you moved me out of that room before Greer's team reached it. Because you called the response team from a landline in a maintenance closet when every other option was compromised. And because... She stopped. Her good hand, resting on her knee, closed slightly. Because I looked you up. Before I came here, I had the facility staff list reviewed. I know what your file says, or what it doesn't say. Nora was still. Classified specialty, accelerated advancement, separated voluntarily at the peak of an operational career. Vasquez held her gaze. People don't leave that kind of career voluntarily unless something changed, unless they made a decision about what they were and what they wanted to do with it. The room was very quiet. I need you to do something for me, Vasquez said. What? The secured annex on the basement level. Greer mentioned it, which means whoever briefed his team knew about it too. I need to know whether the annex has been accessed in the last 24 hours and whether the access log has been altered. Nora frowned. That's a CID function. Decker can request it through official channels, which means it goes through the facility administration before it comes back to him. If the internal source is administrative level, then the request gets flagged before it gets answered, Nora said. I need someone who can physically go to that annex and read the access panel directly. The panel log is hardware. It can't be altered remotely. It's the only version that can't be touched. I don't have clearance for the basement annex. No, Vasquez said. But your keycard has been coded for all clinical access levels since your military background triggered an automatic security classification when you were hired. Most people don't know that's how the system works. She paused. I checked. Nora looked at her. You've been planning for contingencies. Since the moment I was admitted, Vasquez said. I knew the risk of coming here. I didn't know it would happen this fast. Her jaw tightened. The documentation is safe, but if the annex log shows unauthorized access in the last day, it tells us exactly who we're dealing with. Nora stood up. She thought about what she was being asked. Going to a restricted area of a facility that was still technically an active investigation scene, reading a hardware access log that she was not officially cleared to review, on the word of a Marine captain whose account she had no way to independently verify. She thought about every correct, cautious, system-trusting decision she had made over the last 10 months. She also thought about 3 service members whose deaths had been filed as enemy contact. I'll be back in 15 minutes, she said. Your shoulder needs a dressing when I return. Vasquez nodded once. Nora went out. The basement was busier than it had been when she'd come through it during the incident. 2 CID personnel were working near the electrical panels, and she could hear voices from the direction of the HVAC room. She moved with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who belonged in the space, which was the most effective camouflage available and cost nothing. The secured annex was in the northeast corner of the basement, behind a cipher-locked interior door marked with a restricted access designation she had never had reason to look at closely before. Her keycard reader was in her pocket. She held it up to the panel. The light went green. She stood there for a full second because she had half expected it not to. Had half expected Vasquez to have been wrong, or for the access to have been deliberately downgraded at some point. But the light was green and the door released with a clean mechanical click, and she pushed it open and went in. The annex was small. 3 workstations, a sealed document safe, and along the far wall a hardware access panel that logged every entry with a timestamp and a keycard ID. The panel was a standalone unit, dark green display, old system hardware that ran on a closed circuit not connected to the facility's network. She found the log for the previous 24 hours without difficulty. There were 4 entries. 2 from the previous day, time-stamped and associated with keycards she didn't recognize but that carried appropriate clearance designations. A 3rd from early that morning, 6:41 a.m., more than 2 hours before the incident, from a card ID she did recognize. She recognized it because she had seen it on the access log she reviewed during her normal shift prep. It was the keycard assigned to the Chief of Administration. Garrett Pullman had accessed the secured annex at 6:41 in the morning, 2 hours before 4 armed men walked through a security gap he had done nothing to fix for an entire year. Nora photographed the panel display with her phone. Then she saw the 4th entry. It was time-stamped 40 minutes ago. During the active incident, during the period when the response team had been managing the building and movement between floors, had been restricted and logged. The keycard ID on the fourth entry did not match any designation she recognized. It was not a facility card. It was a visitor override code, the kind used by high-clearance external personnel during official inspections. Someone had accessed this annex during the incident itself, not Greer's team. They had been on the second floor. The fourth man had been on the roof. Someone else. Someone who was in this building right now, with visitor override clearance, who had accessed a secured federal document annex during an active hostage situation while the response teams were occupied on the upper floors. Nora photographed the fourth entry separately. She stood in the annex for exactly 3 seconds, processing the implication. Then she heard a sound from outside the annex door. Footsteps, unhurried, moving toward her specific location in the basement with the precision of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She looked at the annex door. She looked at the hardware panel. She calculated the distance between her current position and the door, and the distance between the footsteps and the door, and the number of seconds available to her. Not enough to get out before the door opened. She stepped behind the door to the hinge side and pressed her back against the wall. The door opened. A figure stepped in. Male, civilian clothing, moving directly toward the hardware panel without pausing, without checking the room. He was focused on the panel the way someone focused on a task they had rehearsed. In his right hand was a small device she recognized as a hardware interface unit, the kind used to write directly to closed-circuit log systems. He was going to alter the access record. He hadn't seen her. He was 3 feet from the panel when Nora came off the wall. She had the arm and the device in the same motion, the interface unit clattering to the floor, and she got him turned and pressed against the workstation before he completed his first reactive movement. He was bigger than the man in the east corridor, broader, taller, with the specific muscle density of someone who kept himself in condition not for aesthetics, but for utility. He was also trained. He responded faster than the east corridor subject, and for approximately 4 seconds it was genuinely contested. He got his weight into it, drove backward, and she had to adjust and go lower, changing her leverage point to compensate. Something knocked against the workstation and one of the monitors went dark. She felt her left forearm take the edge of his elbow at the wrong angle, and the sting of it ran up to her shoulder. Then she had the mechanical advantage and he didn't. She got him down on one knee, arm locked, and she was breathing harder than she wanted to be when she said, close to his ear, "Don't." He was breathing hard too. He was also, in the silence after the struggle, completely still. Not compliant exactly, but not resisting, the particular stillness of someone running a calculation. "The log is photographed," she said. "Both entries. It doesn't matter what you do to the panel now." Another calculation. She could feel it in the tension of the arm under hers. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was controlled, despite the position, despite the breathing. A different kind of controlled than Greer's, more internal, less performed. "I'm the nurse everyone ignores," she said. She held him. And then, from the direction of the stairwell, closer than it should have been, which meant they had been tracking her movement through the building, she heard Hartwell's voice and Decker's and the particular sound of multiple people moving with purpose toward a specific location. The man under her arm heard it too. And what he said next, quietly, in the moment before the door was going to open, was not a threat, and it was not a denial, and it was not anything she had expected. What he said was, "Pullman didn't work alone." The door opened. The door hit the wall hard when Decker came through it, and the sound bounced off the concrete walls of the annex in a way that made the small room feel even smaller. He took in the scene in about 1 second. Nora, her left forearm discolored where the elbow had connected, holding a large man face down against a workstation with the arm torqued behind his back. And his expression went through several things in rapid succession before settling on something that was professionally neutral and personally alarmed. Hartwell was 2 steps behind him. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the man on the workstation, and something in her face changed in a way that Nora caught and stored. "You know him," Nora said. Hartwell didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the man with the particular controlled blankness of someone receiving information they needed time to process, which in Nora's experience meant the information was neither new nor welcome. "His name is Warren Solis," Hartwell said finally. "He's assigned to my agency." The room was very quiet. Decker looked at Hartwell, then at Solis, then at the hardware interface unit on the floor. "He was going to write to the annex log," Nora said. "Alter the timestamp on Pullman's access this morning. I photographed the panel before he came in. Both entries are documented." She paused. "He also told me Pullman didn't work alone." Solis, face against the workstation surface, said nothing. "Warren," Hartwell said. Her voice was flat. Not cold exactly. Something drier than cold. The voice of someone who had decided that emotion was not available for this particular moment. "Talk to me." "I want a lawyer," he said into the workstation. "You're not under arrest yet," Decker said. "Then I want to stand up." Nora looked at Decker. He nodded. She stepped back and let Solis straighten, which he did slowly, and he turned to face the room with the expression of someone who had run out of moves and knew it, and was deciding what posture to maintain in the absence of options. He was in his early 50s, fit, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had probably always looked authoritative and was currently working hard to maintain that. His right arm was going to bruise where she'd had it. She'd been harder than she intended again, because he'd resisted longer than the first one, but it was functional, and he held it carefully at his side rather than cradling it, which was either pride or tradecraft. "The access log entry at 6:41, Nora said, keeping her voice even. "Pullman was here before the incident. That's not coincidental." "That's for investigators to determine," Solis said. "You came down here to make sure they couldn't determine it correctly," she said, "which means you knew what Pullman did, which means you either directed it or allowed it." He looked at her with something that was almost professional appraisal, the way Greer had looked at her, the recognition that she was operating at a register he hadn't anticipated. Unlike Greer, there was no respect in it. What was in it was closer to calculation. Decker said, "I'm going to need both of you upstairs." Attempt. The next 4 hours were the kind of institutional machinery that Nora had always found exhausting. The layering of jurisdictions, the careful negotiation of who had authority over what, the particular friction that occurred when military command, federal law enforcement, and intelligence agencies found themselves occupying the same physical space with partially overlapping and partially conflicting mandates. She answered questions 3 more times, each time to a slightly different configuration of people, each time covering the same timeline with the same specificity. By the 3rd iteration, she had it down to a precise sequence, and she delivered it without editorializing, without filling silences that weren't hers to fill, and without the self-deprecating qualifiers that she had spent 10 months reflexively adding to everything she said in this building. Between interviews, she went back to her floor. This was not negotiable for her. There were people in those rooms who had been through a genuinely frightening experience and whose clinical needs did not pause for federal jurisdiction questions. And she was not willing to let that slip because she was a person of interest in an evolving investigation. She said this plainly to the investigator who tried to keep her on the 4th floor, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the boundary he was trying to enforce was not going to hold, and he let her go. Corporal Briggs had developed a low-grade fever by mid-afternoon, not unexpected given the stress load and the 2 hours of missed monitoring, and Nora caught it at the 3:40 assessment and called Dr. Marsh immediately. Marsh came in fast, which was different from how she'd operated this morning, and she stood at the foot of Briggs' bed and listened to Nora's assessment and the protocol she'd already initiated without once using the words, "stay in your lane." Progress, Nora thought, in a dry and private way. The colonel was sleeping when she checked him, which was good. His incision remained stable. She updated his chart and moved on. Obi-Tran was not sleeping. He was sitting up in bed with the monitor leads attached. Still attached, which she noted with genuine relief. And he had the television on a news channel with the volume at the lowest possible setting, watching the scroll at the bottom of the screen with the focused attention of someone who already knew what he was looking for. "It's not on the news yet," she said from the doorway. He looked over. "It'll be on by tonight." "Maybe." She came in and checked his readings. Heart rate was down to 78, which was considerably better. "How do you feel?" Better than I should, probably. He looked at her. The same assessing look he'd given her before, but different now, the earlier version having been revised several times since. Did you find out what it was about? Some of it. More is still being determined. The nurse who called it in from a landline in a supply closet. He shook his head slightly. That's on the news scroll. They're not using a name yet. She said nothing. Obi, he said. What? My name. You've been calling me Staff Sergeant Tran for 6 weeks, and I keep meaning to say, Obi is fine. She looked at him for a moment. There was something unexpectedly human in the offer, in the timing of it, in the fact that he'd chosen this afternoon, of all afternoons, to extend that small, informal bridge. Obi, she said, keep the monitor on. Not planning to take it off, he said, which was the closest he had come to a concession in 6 weeks. And she took it. At 5:15, Garrett Pullman was escorted from his office on the 4th floor by 2 military police officers and Agent Decker. Nora was at the nursing station when it happened. She didn't see it directly. She heard it, the particular sound of official escort in a civilian corridor, the quality of silence that fell over the people nearby when they understood what they were witnessing. Donna was at the station, and she saw it through the window that looked toward the elevator bank, and she turned to Nora with an expression that had several things in it at once. They're taking Pullman, Donna said. Nora looked at the chart she was updating. Yes. Is he... Donna stopped, started again. Your security reports, the ones he told you went through proper review. Yes. Did he... That's for investigators to determine, Nora said, which was the accurate answer, and she kept writing. She said it accurately and without satisfaction, which surprised her slightly. She had imagined, in the abstract, in the way she sometimes ran through hypothetical outcomes during long shifts, that the moment when the dismissal of her work was publicly connected to something beyond ordinary negligence would feel like a resolution, like the ledger being corrected. What it actually felt like was complicated and muted because Pullman's accountability was threaded through a situation in which 3 service members were dead, and Vasquez had been carrying evidence of that for 8 months, and the whole mechanism of it, the selling of a route, the exchange, the people who had done the exchanging, was still only partially visible. The ledger wasn't corrected. It was being examined. Those were different things. Doctor. Marsh came to the station at 6 o'clock, which was an hour after Nora's shift was technically supposed to end, and an hour during which Nora had given no indication of leaving. Marsh stood at the edge of the station counter with the careful posture of someone who had been thinking about a conversation for hours and was no longer willing to defer it. The security reports, Marsh said, both of them. I'd like you to walk me through what you documented. Nora looked up. Now? I'd prefer it. Marsh's voice had a specific quality, not quite apologetic because she wasn't built for easy apology, but stripped of the professional distance that had always characterized their exchanges before. The plainness of someone who had decided that managing appearances was a cost they could no longer justify. I want to understand what I signed off on ignoring. You signed off on a meeting and a memo, Nora said. You didn't ignore it directly. I also told you to focus on your patients and let the experienced people handle structural decisions. Nora looked at her for a long moment. I remember. I know you do. Marsh set her tablet down on the counter. Walk me through it. So Nora walked her through it. The east entrance, the exterior ladder, the lockdown protocol gaps, the camera blind spot in the east service corridor, the magnetic lock on the badge swipe door that had never been reset. She was specific. She didn't soften it. She also didn't perform vindication, because what had happened today was not a vindication. It was a confirmation of a risk that should have been addressed before it became a reality, and confirmation through a crisis was the worst possible version of being right. Marsh listened without interrupting. Her expression went through things that she didn't try to hide, which was new. At the end, she said, I'm going to submit a formal incident review citing both reports and my response to them. You should, Nora said. I'm also going to request that the facility's security assessment process be restructured so that clinical staff safety concerns are escalated directly to the base command rather than through administrative channels. That's what I recommended in the second report. I know. A pause. I should have read it more carefully. She picked up her tablet. I'm sorry, Nora. That's insufficient given the day you've had, but it's what I have to offer. Nora thought about the supply corridor this morning, the IV bags she'd been counting, the east door that opened and didn't close. She thought about October and focus on your patients and the particular well-meaning way that dismissal had been delivered. It's a start, she said. Marsh nodded once and left. Ciao. At 7 in the evening, Colonel Finch called her to the first-floor conference room. He was not alone. Hartwell was there, and Decker, and a man in uniform whom Finch introduced as Brigadier General Stokes, who had arrived from the base command in the last hour, and who carried the particular gravity of someone whose presence changed the weight of every other person in the room. Nora sat down. I'll be direct, Finch said. The investigation into this morning's incident has developed in ways that affect both the scope of federal involvement and the status of several individuals currently associated with this facility. Some of what I'm about to tell you is still classified at a level that will require a formal NDA before the detailed briefing can occur. What I can tell you now, in general terms, is this. He paused. Garrett Pullman has been placed under federal custody. He is being processed on charges related to the unauthorized disclosure of protected military personnel information, specifically the disclosure of Captain Vasquez's admission records and schedule to a third-party contractor operating outside sanctioned channels. Nora held his gaze. She didn't say anything. Warren Solis, Hartwell said, has been relieved of his agency credentials pending an internal review. The access log documentation you photographed has been entered into evidence and has been independently verified as unaltered. A pause. Your decision to photograph the panel before intervening physically was tactically sound. It seemed important to have a record that couldn't be contested, Nora said. It was, Decker said. It is. General Stokes, who had been listening without expression, spoke for the first time. Ms. Callahan, I've been briefed on your service record, the unclassified summary, as well as the relevant classified portions, which my clearance covers. His voice was measured. Not warm, not cold, simply the voice of someone who communicated primarily through precision. Your actions today were consistent with specialized training that you have not disclosed to this facility in any formal capacity. I was hired as a nurse, she said. I've been doing that job. You have, he said, by all accounts, exceptionally. He looked at her steadily. The question of how that background intersects with your current employment and what obligations or opportunities might exist at this facility as a result is a conversation we will need to have through appropriate channels. A pause. But I want it on record that this institution, and the military installation that oversees it, is aware of what you did today and what it prevented. Nora sat with that. She had imagined this moment in the way she imagined most things that weren't immediately pressing, loosely, at a distance, without letting herself want it too specifically, because wanting things that depended on other people's perceptions was a reliable way to be disappointed. She had imagined a version of being acknowledged that felt like a door opening, like the lifting of a weight she had been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its specific shape. This was not that. It was more complicated. It was a room full of people with competing interests and partially aligned agendas, and the particular institutional discomfort of having been wrong about someone and needing to manage the implications of that. But underneath those complications, it was also real. Someone with the authority to say it was saying it, and that was not nothing. Thank you, she said, and she meant it, partially, which was honest. Months. She was in the parking lot at 8:47 that evening, which was 12 hours after she'd arrived, sitting in her car with the engine off and the heater running and her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had been hot an hour ago and wasn't anymore. Her left forearm had been examined by one of the facility physicians and confirmed as a moderate contusion, no fracture, functional, would be uncomfortable for a week. She had written that into her own incident report with the same specificity she applied to everything. Her phone was on the passenger seat. It had 7 missed calls, 2 from a number she didn't recognize, which she would deal with in the morning, and 5 from her older brother in Sacramento, who had apparently seen something on the national news that had not yet included her name, but that he had apparently connected to her through some combination of sibling intuition and geographic knowledge of Virginia military facilities. She would call him back. Not tonight. She drank the cold coffee and thought about nothing specific for about 4 minutes, which was as close as she could get to not thinking at all. And then she thought about Greer's face when he'd said the mission was already compromised. She thought about Solis in the annex and the hardware interface unit on the floor, and what it meant that someone with agency credentials had been positioned inside this operation as a failsafe for the failsafe. Pullman didn't work alone. She believed that. She also believed that Solis was not the full answer, that someone had sent Solis the same way someone had contracted Meridian, the same way someone had accessed Vasquez's admission records and schedule and fed that intelligence to Greer's team. The operational structure of it was layered in a way that suggested something larger than 2 men with adjacent access and coordinated motives. She was a nurse. She had put that thought in front of the right people tonight, and she had let them carry it forward. That was the correct division of responsibility. She was not going to take the investigation personally, was not going to pull threads she wasn't positioned to pull, was not going to let the last 12 hours convince her that the right response to today was a permanent shift in her approach to the job she had chosen. She almost believed all of that. At 9:11, her phone rang. Not a missed call returning, a live call, from a number she recognized this time, because she had stored it in her contacts that afternoon. Vasquez. She picked up. "I've been moved to a secure facility," Vasquez said without preamble. Her voice sounded tired but controlled. "I won't be at Crestfield past tomorrow." "How's the shoulder?" "They redressed it here. It's fine." A brief pause. "I wanted to tell you something before the process gets formal, and I'm not allowed to say it through a casual channel." "What?" "The documentation is being reviewed by the right people now. Because of the chain of events today, because of what you found in that annex and how you documented it, the case has been elevated in a way that my commanding officer's office has been trying to achieve for 3 months. Nora looked through the windshield at the parking lot. The lights were on over the east entrance, and she could see from here the place where the door had stood open all morning, the magnetic lock that had never been reset. "The 3 service members," Nora said. "Will the families—" "That process will take time," Vasquez said. "It's going to be complicated and ugly, and a lot of people are going to spend years arguing about jurisdiction and classification and who owed disclosure to whom." A pause. "But it's going to happen. That part, I'm confident about." "Good," Nora said. Another pause. Vasquez's voice, when she continued, was slightly different in register, the military precision dropping back half a degree toward something more personal. "Why did you actually leave?" she asked. "The Navy. A career like that." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I got tired of operating in situations where the rules were made by people who weren't in them," she said finally. "I wanted to do something where the work was the work, where I could see directly what I was fixing. And instead you spent 10 months submitting security reports into a void." "Something like that. Does it still feel like the right decision?" Nora looked at the east entrance. She thought about Corporal Briggs sitting in bed with her jaw set and her hands very still. She thought about Obi saying Obi is fine in the same afternoon he'd kept his monitor leads attached for the first time. "Ask me again in a month," she said. Vasquez made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Fair enough." Another pause. "Take care of your arm." "It's a contusion." "I know what it is. Take care of it anyway." The call ended. Nora sat for another few minutes. Then she started the car, because the coffee was completely cold, and the evening had been long, and there was nothing more to be resolved tonight through sitting in a parking lot. She pulled out of her space and drove toward the exit. At the gate, her headlights swept across the east face of the building. The exterior wall, the maintenance ladder running up the south side, the window of the administrative suite on the 3rd floor where someone had left it open in the middle of February. The window had been closed now. Someone had gotten around to it. She drove home. 3 days later, the news broke publicly. Not the full account, not the classified portions, but enough. A regional outlet ran a piece about the armed incursion at Crestfield Military Medical Center that mentioned a security vulnerability that had been documented in staff reports and not addressed. A national outlet picked it up within 6 hours and added the detail about administrative staff being placed under federal investigation in connection with the incident. Garrett Pullman's name appeared in the 4th paragraph. The piece did not name Nora. Her role in the response was described as a staff member with prior military experience who had initiated the security call and assisted in the protection of patients, and who had provided material evidence to investigators in the course of the response. The language was careful and sourced and accurate, and she read it at the nurse's station between patient checks and set her phone face down on the counter when she was done. Donna, who had read it on her own phone approximately 4 minutes earlier, did not say anything immediately. She was good at reading when silence was more useful than speech, which was one of the things Nora had come to appreciate about her. Eventually she said, "Material evidence." "That's what they're calling it," Nora said. "You took a picture of a computer log and held a man down on a workstation while doing it." In sequence, not simultaneously. Donna looked at her for a moment. "I'm glad you were here," she said. Simple, direct, without performance. Then she went back to her charts. Nora went back to hers. The pace of the day was familiar. Assessments, medication rounds, a complication on a post-op patient in room 206 that required rapid escalation, and a call to the surgical team that she had initiated before the attending physician had finished reading the chart she'd flagged. The attending, a younger physician named Dr. Kasabian, who had been at Crestfield less than 3 months and had not yet accumulated the particular institutional arrogance that seemed to grow in people with tenure here, listened to her assessment and agreed with it immediately and said, "Good catch," in the tone of someone who actually meant it. Small things. The accumulation of them was something. On the 4th day after the incident, she was called to Finch's office. He was not alone, the same configuration as before, except General Stokes was not there. In his place was a woman in her mid-50s in civilian professional dress, who had the specific quality of a person who chose to look nondescript deliberately, and whose name was given as Dr. Elaine Farrow, and whose institutional affiliation was described as Federal Health Security Oversight, which Nora translated as either DHS or something adjacent to it. "We're here to discuss 3 things," Finch said. "In this order. First, the formal acknowledgement of your documented security reports and the institutional failures associated with their dismissal. Second, the operational review that will restructure the administrative chain for staff safety concerns at this facility. And third," he paused, with the specific quality of a man delivering the item that had required the most deliberation, "a request from General Stokes' office and from Dr. Farrow's office jointly that you consider a different role here." Nora looked at him steadily. "What role?" "Facility security liaison," Farrow said. Her voice was precise and not unkind. "It's a newly created position. It didn't exist before this week, which is part of the problem this incident has made apparent. The role would involve direct oversight of clinical staff safety reporting, escalation authority to both base command and federal health security, and formal coordination with the military installation security operations." A pause. "You would still work with patients. That was a condition that was understood from the beginning of the conversation about this." Nora said, "Why me?" Farrow looked at her. "Because you documented the correct problems for 10 months. Your documentation was provably accurate, and when the problems you documented were exploited, you responded with an effectiveness that we are genuinely not going to find in a standard administrative hire." She paused. "Because your background, which we're now fully informed of, is directly relevant, and because the staff here trust you, the clinical staff specifically, in a way that this position requires." "That trust is recent," Nora said. "Most trust is," Farrow said. Finch said, "You don't have to decide now. We're asking you to consider it." Nora looked at the table. She thought about what she had told Vasquez, that she'd left the Navy because she wanted to see directly what she was fixing. She thought about Briggs in room 204 and Obi with his monitor leads, and the colonel sitting in the bathroom with his blanket and his 40 years of knowing how to wait. She thought about the east entrance and the folder where her first report had gone. "There's a condition," she said. Finch nodded. "Say it." The security assessment process that Dr. Marsh proposed. Direct escalation from clinical staff to base command. No administrative filter. That has to be operational before I take on any additional role. Not planned. Operational. Finch looked at Farrow. Farrow looked at her notes. 2 weeks, Farrow said. We can have the framework operational in 2 weeks. Then I'll give you an answer in 2 weeks, Nora said. She stood to leave. She was at the door when Farrow said, Ms. Callahan. One more thing. Her voice had a quality that was different from the official register she'd been using, slightly less positioned. Solis, he's in federal custody and his cooperation has been substantial. Nora turned. He's described a network, Farrow said. The people who directed the operation from above Meridian and above Pullman. He's named 4 individuals in the initial debrief. She paused. One of them has authority over multiple military medical facilities across the eastern seaboard. Nora stood very still. We're moving carefully, Farrow said, but I want you to know because you're the reason Solis didn't alter that log, and therefore the reason we have a case that doesn't collapse at the evidentiary foundation, that the scope of what you protected today is larger than this building. Nora looked at her for a moment. What happens now? She asked. Now the people above my pay grade do what they do, Farrow said, which is deliberately slow and largely invisible and will involve a great deal of careful work before anything becomes public. She held Nora's gaze. But it happens. Nora nodded. She went out. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with the door closed behind her, and the institutional sounds of the building moved around her. The elevator, the HVAC, the baseline activity of a facility running its ordinary work. And she let herself be still inside it for exactly as long as it took to understand that the thing she'd started this morning in a supply corridor with a set of IV bags was not finished, and that its not being finished was not a failure, and that some things you began without knowing their full shape and only understood what you'd built when you looked back at it from somewhere further along. Then she went downstairs. Corporal Briggs' fever had broken the previous night, and her mobility assessment was scheduled for 10:30, and Nora was not going to be late for it. She was on the second-floor landing when her phone buzzed. Not a call, a message, from a number that had been flagged by her carrier as originating outside the U.S. The message contained 4 words and a file attachment. The 4 words were, "You should see this." The file attachment was a photograph, high resolution, time-stamped from 6 hours earlier, showing a man exiting a building she recognized as a federal courthouse in a city she had never been to. The man's face was turned slightly away from the camera, but not far enough. She had a good memory for faces, and she had a particular memory for this one. She had seen it once, briefly, in the basement annex, when Solis had turned to find her coming off the wall. The man in the photograph was not in federal custody. He was walking out of a courthouse in a suit, with a briefcase, and the timestamp on the photograph was from that morning. Nora stood on the landing with her phone in her hand and the photograph on the screen and the particular quality of cold clarity that she had last felt standing behind a door in an East Wing service corridor, and she understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that someone outside this building, someone with the knowledge to connect her to the annex, to the evidence, to the case that Farrow had described as not collapsing, was telling her that one of the 4 names Solis had given was already free. She stood on the landing for 11 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. An old habit, the kind that came from environments where 11 seconds of uncontrolled response could change outcomes in ways that weren't recoverable. In those 11 seconds, she looked at the photograph twice. She confirmed what she was seeing. She registered the number the message had come from and committed it to memory, and she made a decision about what the next 60 minutes needed to look like. Then she called Farrow. The phone rang 4 times. Voicemail. She hung up and called Decker. He picked up on the second ring. "I need you to look at something," she said. "Right now, in person." A pause. "Where are you?" "Second floor landing. Don't use a radio." Another pause, shorter this time. 2 minutes. He was there in 90 seconds, which told her he had been somewhere in the building, still working the case, still pulling threads. He came through the stairwell door, and she showed him the photograph without preamble and watched his face. What moved across it was not the controlled neutral of his professional default. It was something faster and less managed, recognition, and underneath recognition, something that looked like anger being converted in real time into focused attention. "Who sent this?" he said. "Unknown number. International origin." She paused. "Decker. Who is he?" Decker looked at the photograph for another second. Then he looked at her and made a decision she could see him making. "His name is Malcolm Rourke," he said. "He was the fourth name Solis gave us in the debrief, deputy director level at a defense contracting oversight body. He has authority over federal health security contracts at 11 military medical facilities." He paused. "He was detained yesterday morning for processing." "He's not detained now." "No." Decker's jaw tightened. "He's apparently not." "How?" "That is a question I am going to find the answer to in the next 30 minutes. He was already on his phone, not his radio, she noticed, his personal cell. "I need you to forward me that photograph and the sender number right now." She did. He looked at the incoming Ford, then looked at her. "Go to your patients. Don't discuss this with anyone in this building until I come back to you." "How long?" "I don't know." He was already moving. "Lock your phone." He went through the stairwell door, and she heard his footsteps descending at a pace that was not quite running. She went to her patients. This was not avoidance. It was the most honest thing she could do with the next period of time, because the photograph, and whatever it meant, were in Decker's hands and not hers, and the people in rooms 204, 207, and 211 had legitimate needs that did not pause for the complications of federal investigations. She had learned, in a different context, in a different decade, that the best thing you could do in a situation where the next development was out of your control was to do the work that was in front of you and do it completely, because incomplete work in the space where you did have control was how you lost the thread of yourself. Corporal Briggs was sitting up in bed at a 45-degree angle, which was different from this morning. She had been flat. The mobility assessment team was not due for another 20 minutes. Nora came in and saw the position change and felt the familiar quick calculation. "How long have you been sitting up?" she asked. "About an hour." Briggs looked at her steadily. "It felt better than lying down. The leg's been bothering me more." Nora checked color, warmth, palpation along the vein pathway, and the picture was not dramatically worse, but the increased discomfort was meaningful, and she made a note. She adjusted the compression schedule, confirmed the timing on the next imaging order, and spent a few minutes talking Briggs through what the mobility assessment would actually involve, which was not because Briggs seemed anxious, but because information was what Briggs processed best, and she had learned that about her over the course of these weeks. "Is it true?" Briggs asked, partway through. "What they're saying, that someone in the administration here was connected to what happened?" "That's being investigated," Nora said. "That's not a no." "No," Nora said. "It isn't." Briggs was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. "You knew something was wrong, before that morning." "I had concerns. I reported them." "And nobody listened." Nora looked at her chart, made a notation. "People listened. They chose not to act." "That's worse," Briggs said. "Yes," Nora said. "It is." She finished the assessment and moved on. The colonel was in mild discomfort. The hip was aching, which was normal and expected at this stage, and he was managing it with the deliberate stoicism of a man who had decided that complaints were a currency he spent carefully. She adjusted his pain management protocol, and he accepted this without argument, which meant the discomfort was real enough to override his preference for self-sufficiency. "I've been reading about the incident," he said, while she updated his chart. "The news version." "Yes." "It's incomplete." "Most news is." He looked at her for a moment. "The staff member with prior military experience who assisted in patient protection and provided material evidence to investigators." She kept writing. "That's a very careful way of describing what actually happened," he said. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression he'd had in the bathroom, the patient, experienced look of someone who had spent 4 decades assessing people in situations where the assessment mattered. "You told me to go to the bathroom," he said, "and I went, because something about the way you said it made me trust that you knew what you were doing." He paused. "I've given that order to people. I know what it sounds like when it comes from someone with the experience to back it up. Another pause. I don't think you got enough credit for what you did. She held his gaze for a moment. I got patients through a difficult morning, she said. That's the job. It's more than that, and you know it. She did know it. She also knew that accepting that fully, in this moment, in this room, with this man, was something she was going to have to practice. That being seen accurately after a long period of being seen incorrectly required a different kind of adjustment than she had expected. Not the relief she'd anticipated. Something more complicated. Something that had to be approached incrementally, the way you approached any significant recalibration. Get some rest, she said. The mobility team wants you walking the corridor this afternoon. I'll be ready, he said, which she believed completely. Decker found her at 12:43. She was at the nursing station in the middle of a documentation cycle, and he came through the corridor door with Hartwell behind him and the expression of someone who had spent the last 2 hours in a sequence of conversations that had moved fast and landed hard. Conference room, he said. Now. She set down the tablet and followed. The room had more people in it than she expected. Farrow was there, and Finch, and a man she hadn't seen before in a uniform with insignia that clarified the elevation of what she was walking into. A 2-star, which meant this had gone above Stokes' level while she was updating patient charts. Sit down, Farrow said. She sat. Malcolm Rourke was released this morning on a federal writ filed by his legal team at 6 a.m., Farrow said without preamble. The writ cited procedural grounds related to the classification level of the material in his debrief. His attorneys argued that his detention pending further investigation constituted an unlawful disclosure of classified information. She paused. The writ was signed by a federal judge. It was legitimate. Was, Nora said. Was. Farrow's voice was flat. The photograph you received this morning was sent by a source that we have now identified as a member of Captain Vasquez's investigative unit. Someone operating outside official channels because they didn't trust that the official channels would move fast enough. They were right, Nora said. They were. Farrow looked at her. The photograph was taken at 7:41 this morning. By 8:15, the source had shared it with Vasquez's commanding officer, who had shared it with us, who had shared it with the federal judge who signed the writ. A pause. The grounds for the writ were reviewed in light of additional evidentiary material that came forward this morning. The annex log, Nora said. The annex log, and a second piece of documentation that Vasquez's unit had been holding, but the original, not the copy she was bringing here. It was submitted to federal court this morning through Vasquez's commanding officer. Farrow paused. Malcolm Rourke was redetained at 11:18 a.m. Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about the photograph on her landing, the 11 seconds she'd counted, the particular cold clarity of understanding that something she thought was resolved had opened again. It held this time? She said. It held. Farrow held her gaze. The writ was vacated. The judge who signed the original has recused himself pending a review of how the filing was expedited. That review will establish whether he was manipulated or complicit. She paused. Either way, Rourke is in custody, and the evidentiary chain is intact. The 2-star spoke for the first time. Miss Callahan, what you preserved in that annex 4 days ago, the hardware log, unaltered, became the foundation that every subsequent piece of evidence has been built on. Solis's cooperation, Vasquez's documentation, the case against Rourke. He spoke without ceremony, the way people who were accustomed to being the most senior person in the room often did. Not unkindly, but without the softening that came from needing to manage perceptions. There are 3 families who are going to receive an accurate accounting of what happened to their family members 8 months ago, and that accounting is possible because a staff nurse in a basement annex took a photograph before she stopped someone from destroying the record. Nora looked at the table for a moment. She thought about 3 service members. She thought about their names, which she didn't know. She thought about the shape of a loss that had been filed incorrectly, given the wrong cause, given a story that served someone else's interests instead of the truth of what had happened. When will the families be told? She asked. The notification process begins this week, Farrow said. It will be conducted by their respective service branches with full disclosure. That matters more than any of the rest of this, Nora said. Yes, the two-star said, it does. The formal hearing that followed over the next 3 weeks was not the cinematic version of institutional accountability that resolved cleanly in an afternoon. It was slow and it was procedurally complex, and there were days when the machinery of it felt like it was grinding rather than moving, and there were developments that went in unexpected directions and required recalibration. Rourke's legal team was skilled and aggressive, and they contested every piece of evidence with a thoroughness that was professionally impressive even when it was morally exhausting. But the log held. It held because it was hardware, because Nora had photographed it before Solis reached it, because the timestamp on her photograph predated any possible alteration by 37 minutes, and because that gap was not closable by any legal argument that Rourke's attorneys produced. Pullman's cooperation came in the second week. It came in stages, partial first, then more complete, as the weight of what was arrayed against him became apparent. He had been recruited by Rourke's network 3 years earlier during a period of financial difficulty that had been identified and targeted with the particular predatory patience of people who specialized in finding leverage. He had not sold the operational intelligence directly. He had simply made access easier, year by year, the way that compromised people often operated. Not in single dramatic acts, but in a long accumulation of small permissions and deliberate ignorances. The security reports, the east entrance, the exterior ladder, the lockdown gaps. He had not created those vulnerabilities, but he had been paid, indirectly and deniably, to make sure they stayed. When that specific piece of testimony became part of the formal record, when the mechanism of how her reports had been buried was formally documented and attributed, Nora was not in a courtroom or a conference room. She was on the second floor of Crestfield doing a medication round, and Donna read it off her phone screen in a low voice, and Nora nodded and kept doing the round, because that was the right response. Not because she didn't feel it. She did, sharply and specifically, the particular anger of having a long-held suspicion confirmed in public. But because the confirmation didn't change what she needed to do in the next 30 minutes, and letting it stop her would have been a kind of capitulation to the idea that the institutional failure was more important than the work it had tried to suppress. It wasn't. She was more important. Her work was more important. She had known that even when no one else did, and she had kept working anyway, and that was not a small thing, and she finally, fully, in that fluorescent-lit corridor, with a medication cart and a clipboard, allowed herself to understand it as something worth knowing about herself. Rourke's sentencing was 11 weeks after the day of the incident. The charges included conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, unauthorized disclosure of classified military personnel information, and conspiracy in connection with events leading to the deaths of 3 service members, the last charge being the one that had taken the longest to build and that carried the most weight. His legal team had negotiated hard on that last count and failed. The documentation Vasquez had carried, combined with the communications chain that Solis's cooperation had made traceable, was sufficient, and the jury found it so. He received 22 years. The number was in a notification Farrow sent to Nora's phone. Not a formal briefing, not a conference room, just a text message that said, "Sentencing concluded. 22 years, no parole eligibility for 14. Families have been notified. Thought you should know." Nora was on her lunch break when it arrived. She was sitting in the staff room with a sandwich she had been eating without much attention, and she read the message twice and set the phone face down on the table and finished the sandwich. She sat there for a while after. She thought about Rourke walking out of that courthouse in the photograph, the briefcase, the suit, the particular ease of a man who was accustomed to systems bending around his needs. She thought about the 11 seconds on the landing. She thought about the hardware interface unit clattering to the floor in the annex and the struggle against the workstation, and her arm finding the correct leverage angle even when it was contested. She thought about what Farrow had said, that the scope of what she'd protected was larger than this building, and she tried to hold that alongside the reality of what it had cost and what it had not fixed, because both things were true, and only holding both made the picture accurate. 3 families had the truth now. That was not a complete repair of the damage. It didn't resurrect anything. But it was the difference between a lie and a record, and records were what accountability ran on. And accountability was slow and imperfect and morally exhausting and worth doing anyway. She believed that. She had always believed it. She had just spent 10 months in a place that had made it very hard to trust. She threw away the sandwich wrapper and went back to work. The security liaison position became official on a Thursday in late spring, 39 days after Pharaoh's deadline. The framework had taken 41 days instead of 14. Nora had known it would, and had said so when they missed the first deadline, and Finch had acknowledged it without making excuses, which she respected. 2 days late was not acceptable, but it was real, and real was what she'd asked for. The position came with a formal title, a salary adjustment, and an office she didn't particularly want but accepted because the alternative was working from the nursing station, which was already insufficient for 2 jobs. The office was small and had a window that faced the maintenance structure across the back lot, which she found appropriate in a way she didn't explain to anyone. She kept her patient load. This was not negotiable, and she had stated it plainly in the initial discussions and every subsequent one. She was not becoming an administrator. She was a nurse who had additional responsibilities that happened to involve institutional security, and the distinction mattered because the work she did with patients was not a background feature of her career. It was the point of it. It was the reason she was here. It was the thing she had left the Navy to do, and she had not spent 10 months refusing to be diminished only to diminish it herself. Pharaoh had looked at her when she said this with the expression of someone who had expected the negotiation and had already decided to concede it. "Understood," she'd said. The first formal security assessment under the new protocol took place the following Monday. Nora led it, not alone but as the primary, with a team that included a base security officer, a facilities representative, and doctor. Kasabian, the younger physician who had said good catch 6 weeks ago and who had been recommended by Marsh as the clinical representative most likely to engage with the process seriously. They went through the building systematically. Every entrance, every exit, every camera position and coverage gap, every access panel, and every keycard protocol. Every door that should have had a magnetic lock and didn't, every exterior ladder, and every window that opened to it. It took 4 hours. The report that came out of it was 43 pages. Every page of it would be read by Colonel Finch, and by the base command, and by a federal health security oversight officer, in that order, within 5 days of submission. This was the protocol, the new protocol, the one that existed because the old one had failed in a way that was now formally documented and that no one in the chain of authority wanted to have happen again. Nora submitted the report on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, the base command confirmed receipt and scheduled a response meeting for the following week. On Thursday, Corporal Briggs was discharged. Briggs came to the nursing station before she left. She didn't have to. It wasn't part of the discharge process. But she came. In her uniform, which she'd put back on for the first time in weeks, and she stood at the counter and looked at Nora with the specific directness that had characterized her since the first day. "I wanted to say thank you," Briggs said, "for the morning, and the fever, and just the whole thing." "You did the hard part," Nora said. "You stayed in the bed and kept your leg elevated for 3 weeks. That's not the hard part, and you know it." Briggs paused. "I've been in some bad situations. I know what it looks like when someone keeps their head. You kept yours when everyone else lost theirs." Nora looked at her. "So did you." Briggs shook her head slightly. "I just sat in the bed like you told me." "That's keeping your head," Nora said. "It doesn't have to look like anything dramatic to count." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I heard you took a new role here." "Additional responsibilities, same floor." "Good." Briggs picked up her bag. "This place needed someone like you in it." She left. Donna, who had been quietly present throughout and had the extremely well-developed ability to seem fully occupied with something else while tracking every word of a conversation, did not say anything until Briggs had been gone for a full minute. Then she said, "She's right, you know." "I heard you the first 17 times, Nora said, and Donna made a sound that was definitively a laugh, and Nora pulled up the next chart. Boom. Obi-Tron was discharged 2 days after Briggs, with a full cardiac workup completed and a management plan in place and no further indication of acute risk. The monitoring had caught an arrhythmia during the second week that would have been missed without it, and the intervention had been early and appropriate, and he had said, with characteristic understatement, that he supposed it was a good thing he'd kept the leads on. On his last day, he stood in the doorway of room 211 in his street clothes and looked at her with the expression he'd been refining since the morning of the incident, the one that had started as reassessment and had become over weeks something closer to straightforward regard. "You figured out what you are yet?" he asked. "What I am?" she said. "What you want to be doing. Whether this is the right place." She thought about the 43-page report. She thought about Briggs in the bed and the colonel in the bathroom and the east entrance and the landline in the maintenance closet. She thought about the scar below her left ear that she stopped covering with her collar sometime around the 3rd week after the incident, not as a statement, not as anything deliberate, just because she stopped remembering to do it. "I think so," she said. He nodded. "Good." He shifted the bag on his shoulder. "The monitor thing. I know I made that harder than it needed to be." "You did," she said. "Yeah." A pause. Anyway, she said. He left. She stood at the station for a moment after, in the familiar ambient noise of the floor, the HVAC, the elevator, the baseline rhythm of a place doing its ordinary work. And she let herself feel the particular weight of what ordinary meant. She had spent a long time treating ordinary as a place to get to, a register to reach, a mode of existing that would signal she had successfully transitioned from one version of herself to another. She had been trying, for longer than 10 months, to become someone who fit into rooms without filling them in ways that made people uncomfortable. She didn't think she was going to keep trying to do that, not because of what happened in February, not because one crisis had clarified everything and changed her, because that was not how change actually worked, and she knew it, but because the slow accumulation of the preceding months had shown her something that the crisis had only confirmed, that the parts of herself she had been trying to make smaller were the parts that had mattered, that the training, the instincts, the long and costly education in how to stay functional when everything was unstable, none of it belonged in a box labeled past self. All of it was hers. All of it was part of what made her good at this work, even the work that looked nothing like a battlefield, especially that work. A nurse who noticed what no one else noticed, a nurse who documented what no one would read, a nurse who moved through a building under pressure and got everyone she was responsible for through a morning that should not have happened. That was not despite who she was. It was because of it. 6 weeks after Rourke's sentencing, the facility held a formal ceremony, small, official, in the main conference room rather than anything larger, to recognize the staff response to the February incident. Several people received commendations. Donna, for her composure under direct threat. Dr. Kasabian, for his rapid clinical response in the aftermath. Sergeant Flores and her response team, appropriately. Nora received a formal letter of commendation from the base command and from the Federal Health Security Oversight Body, citing her security documentation, her patient protection actions, and her evidence preservation in the basement annex. Colonel Finch read the commendation aloud, which she had not known he was going to do, and she stood at the front of the conference room and listened to it and kept her face quiet and her posture still. When he finished, he looked at her over the paper. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" he asked. She thought about what to say. She thought about October and focus on your patients and the first security report going into a folder. She thought about February and the IV bags and the east door that opened and didn't close. She thought about everything that had happened between those 2 points, the long months of being certain and being ignored, of doing the work and having it absorbed without acknowledgement, of being present in a building full of people and being functionally invisible. She thought about what it had cost to keep working anyway. "The east entrance is fixed," she said. "The magnetic lock has been reset and is checked on a daily protocol. The exterior ladder has been enclosed with a secured access panel. The lockdown procedure is operational and has been tested 3 times. She paused. "All of that is in the security assessment report. It was also in the reports I submitted 10 months ago." The room was quiet. "I don't say that to score a point," she said. "I say it because the lesson here isn't about what I did in February. The lesson is about what happens when the right information is given to the wrong process." She looked at the people in the room, Finch, Marsh, Kasabian, Donna, the officers. The administrative staff who had come because they had been told to and were now listening in the specific way that people listened when something they were hearing was going to stay with them. I wrote 2 reports. They were accurate. They were professionally formatted and clearly reasoned and submitted through the channels I was told to use. Nothing happened. A pause. If the same thing happened today, if someone in this building right now identified a security gap and submitted a report, I want to be able to tell them that something will happen, that the right process now connects to the right people, and that the information will land where it can actually be used. She looked at Finch. That's what the new protocol is for, she said. That's why it matters. Not because I was right and should have been listened to, but because the next person who's right deserves a system that doesn't require a crisis to make the point for them. The silence in the room had a different quality from the silence she was accustomed to. Not the silence of being talked over, not the silence of people waiting for her to finish, the silence of people absorbing something. Finch nodded once. That's on the record, he said quietly. What? The scar below her left ear was from her last operational deployment. A fragment, a close call, an event she had processed in the military way, which was to be assessed and cleared and moved forward, and then in the civilian way, which was slower and less structured and involved some nights of not sleeping well and some mornings of not wanting to go back into a building that had recently reminded her that buildings could become dangerous without warning. She had those mornings. She had them in March, and a few in April, and occasionally in May. She did not try to eliminate them or perform her way past them. She went in anyway, because that was the decision she'd made, and the mornings passed, and the work was there. And the work was real. She took her brother's calls. She told him what she could. He was not particularly satisfied with what she could tell him, which was consistent with having known her for 31 years. You could come home for a weekend, he said, in the call that happened after the sentencing, which was the call she'd been putting off for the longest. I could, she said. That's not yes. It's not no. Give me a date. He gave her a date. She went. It was a weekend of ordinary things, dinner, her brother's kids being loud in the way that only other people's children were loud, a conversation with his wife about something completely unrelated to anything she'd done in the previous 4 months, a walk around the neighborhood she'd grown up in that was both familiar and revised in the way of all places you return to after becoming someone different. She came back to Dunmore on a Sunday evening and went in Monday morning and stopped at the east entrance on the way in and looked at the magnetic lock. The new one, properly installed, checked daily, logged in the system she had built, and she put her badge to the reader and went through when it clicked green. She was at the nursing station when Donna arrived, and they did the handoff the way they always did, and the day's patients were the day's patients, and somewhere in the South Annex, the security assessment report was being reviewed by the people who were responsible for acting on it, and somewhere in a federal facility, Malcolm Rourke was beginning a sentence that would take a large portion of the remainder of his life, and the 3 families who had buried their family members under a story that wasn't true now had the real story, and none of that made the floor quiet or the fluorescent lights less bright or the medication round less necessary. Nora Callahan picked up her tablet and started her assessments. She was a nurse. She had a classified past that she no longer spent energy trying to separate from the rest of herself. She had a scar she didn't cover. She had 43 pages of security documentation that had been read and acted upon. She had patients who needed someone with steady hands and clear judgment, and the particular kind of calm that came not from the absence of knowledge about what could go wrong, but from having been in situations where it did and having found her way through them. She had a floor. She had work. That was not a small life. That was not a compromise. That was what she had chosen, with full knowledge of what she was and what she was capable of. Chosen not because she couldn't do anything else, but because she had understood, after years of operating in the dark in places that didn't exist on paper, that the most important thing she could do with the skills she had was this: be present, be accurate, and refuse to look away from what needed to be seen. The people who had ignored her reports had counted on her to stay quiet, on her to eventually accept that the system would not move for her. They had misunderstood what quiet was. Quiet was not defeat. Quiet was not compliance. Quiet was what she looked like when she was paying attention, when she was counting exits and mapping positions and building a picture of a situation that no one else had thought to construct. The woman everyone overlooked had been watching the whole time. And when it mattered, she had not flinched. She went to room 204 first, knocked twice, waited the half-second for acknowledgement, and went in. There was a new patient there now, transferred up from the first floor, a young Army corporal named Reyes with a post-surgical complication that had been caught early and was being managed carefully. He was 22 years old, and he looked slightly overwhelmed by the monitoring equipment, and slightly too proud to say so. "Good morning," Nora said. "I'm Nurse Callahan. I'll be covering your care on this floor." She checked his chart, his vitals, the drainage from the surgical site, the color and temperature of the surrounding skin. She did it quickly and completely, and she explained what she was doing as she did it, because patients who understood their own situation were patients who could participate in it, and participation was almost always better than helplessness. Reyes watched her and seemed to relax slightly by increments. "Is the scar from the military?" he asked, looking at her neck. She touched it briefly, automatically, the way she sometimes still did. "Yes." "Where'd you serve?" "Various places." She marked his chart. "How's the pain?" "Honest answer." He made the small grimace of someone choosing between honesty and looking capable. Honesty won. "About a 6. "Okay, let's talk about that." She pulled the chair to his bedside and sat down, which she did with patients who needed to feel that someone had time for them, because she always had time for this, because this was the work, and the work was the point. Outside, the building ran its ordinary morning. The HVAC hummed through the vents. The elevator moved between floors. Somewhere in the administrative wing, a new process was running. Reports going upward, concerns being logged, the slow institutional machinery doing the thing it should always have been doing, now that the people with the authority to make it move had been given an undeniable reason to care. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. The machinery would stall sometimes, and the wrong people would make decisions, and there would be other days when the right information was in the right hands and still didn't land where it needed to, because that was what institutions were. Not evil, most of them, just large and inertial and shaped by the people in charge of them at any given time, which meant they were capable of both the worst kind of negligence and the kind of correction that prevented the negligence from compounding indefinitely. She knew that. She wasn't here because she believed systems were reliable. She was here because she was one of the people who made them less likely to fail, and because the work itself, the actual specific irreplaceable work of caring for people who were sick and hurt, and sometimes frightened, was worth doing for its own sake, in its own right, on its own terms. She had not needed anyone to recognize her in order to know that, but it had mattered that they finally did. Not for her pride, or not only for that because she was human and pride was part of it, and pretending otherwise would have been the kind of false modesty she had stopped performing. It had mattered because recognition was not just personal, it was structural. It was the difference between a system that used her and a system that heard her. And a system that heard her would also hear the next person who noticed something important and wrote it down and submitted it through the correct channels and deserved to have something happen. That was the thing worth protecting. Not the commendation, not the title, not even the closure of a case that had taken 8 months to build and 11 weeks to prosecute and would take years to fully settle. The thing worth protecting was the possibility that the next report, the next careful, accurate, professionally formatted document submitted by someone who had seen something real and taken the trouble to document it, would land in the right place and be read by someone with the authority and the willingness to act. That was what she was here for. That was what she had always been for. She just hadn't had a building that knew it yet. Now she did. She stayed in the chair beside Rhea's bed and talked him through his pain management options, and the morning light came through the window at the angle it always came at this time of year, and the floor was alive and running around her, and Nora Callahan, nurse, liaison, veteran of classified operations in places she would never name, person who took the stairs and kept her phone locked and wrote security reports that were 43 pages long, did her work. The kind that no one sees until the day they need it most.